in the cruelest winter Iron Creek had ever known, when the snow buried the mountain trails and the whole town had already decided the old mountain man was as good as dead. Only one person refused to let him be forgotten. She was the woman they mocked behind her back, the one they called unworthy, unlovable, less than. But while everyone else chose comfort, gossip, and indifference, she chose the frozen wilderness, alone, with nothing but a rope, a knife, and the memory of one small kindness he had shown her at a well on a summer evening. She climbed into the killing cold to find a man who was begging to die. She had no idea that saving him would be the easiest part. The hard part was what came after, when Iron Creek decided that what she had done was not heroic, but shameful. The winter of 1822 did not arrive in Iron Creek so much as it descended upon it, the way a hawk drops on something small and warm and unsuspecting. One week the passes were passable, the next they were not. The sky turned the color of old pewter, and stayed that way for so long that the children of Iron Creek forgot what blue looked like, forgot the particular heat of a summer afternoon, forgot everything except the snow and the wind and the relentless grinding cold that worked its way through every wall and wool coat and carefully banked fire. The settlement itself was a modest collection of ambitions and failures pressed together for warmth. A general store, a church, a boarding house, a blacksmith, a banker's office that smelled of pipe tobacco and quiet authority. 14 families, give or take, depending on the season and the fortunes of those families, and somewhere between 60 and 70 souls who had each, in their own way, decided that this valley between the Iron Creek Range and the Eastern Flatlands was where they intended to make their lives. Some of them had made something. Others were still making. A few had quietly stopped trying and were merely waiting for a more dignified opportunity to leave. The mountains to the west were enormous. They were not to the west, were enormous, that inspired poetry in people who lived beneath them every day. Would you treat them with kindness? They were the kind of enormous that simply reminded you, morning and evening and in the dead of night when the wind came screaming down through the passes, that you were very small, and the mountains were very old, and they did not care about you one way or the other. The pines that lined the upper slopes had gone dark under the accumulated ice. Branches cracked in the night like rifle shots. The streams had frozen solid by the first week of January and had not moved since. It was into this particular stillness, this winter that had made itself permanent, that the absence of Holt Greer slowly became a fact of Iron Creek. He had not come down from the mountain in 10 weeks. Walter Cobb was the first to say it out loud, though he said it with the casualness of a man commenting on weather patterns rather than the potential death of a human being. He was behind the counter of his general store, the iron stove radiating dry heat. 3 men from the settlement arranged around it in the postures of men who had nowhere more pressing to be. When he flipped his ledger to the month of January and said, "Holt Greer hasn't been in for his supplies." The 3 men considered this. Waiting out the storms, one of them offered. Cobb shrugged with his whole torso. "That's what I figured." February came. Then March pushed at February's heels, and February gave way, reluctantly, and still no sign of the man who had lived for 20 years in a cabin at 8,000 feet, like the mountain itself, had decided to grow a resident. The stories began the way. Stories always begin in small places with long winters, quietly at first, tentatively, then with the confidence of repetition. Del Barker, who had the particular gift of making other people's misfortunes sound entertaining, had the most popular version. He held court near Cobb's stove on a Tuesday evening in late March, his boot heels up on the bench, his felt hat pushed back on his head, and told anyone within earshot that Holt Greer had been taken by a gray bear, the biggest one ever seen in the Iron Creek Range, a bear so enormous it had left tracks the size of dinner plates in the snow. According to Del, the bear had found Holt on the trail between his cabin and the lower ridge, and Holt had fought it, because that was the kind of man Holt Greer was. But the bear had won, because that was the kind of bear it was. Would you treat them with kindness? And somewhere up in that white wilderness was whatever remained of a mountain man who had never quite belonged to the world of the living anyway. Man lived like a ghost, Del said, picking at his teeth with a sliver of wood. Makes sense he'd die like one. Quiet. Nobody watching. The men around the stove nodded with the slow satisfaction of people who have just heard a story that ends the way they expected it to end. Nobody suggested a search party. The passes were treacherous. The weather was unpredictable. And Holt Greer was, by all accounts, the kind of man who had made his choices and would have been the first to say that those choices came with consequences. He had chosen the mountain. The mountain had chosen back. That was the frontier. That was the price of living outside the boundaries of community and obligation and the ordinary human compact that said you looked after your neighbors and your neighbors looked after you. Holt Greer had declined that compact 20 years ago. Iron Creek returned the favor now, without malice, without even much reflection. He simply became a past tense, a man who had been. A story that Del Barker would tell for years at Cobb's stove, refining and embellishing until the gray bear was the size of a small barn. There was one person in Iron Creek who did not nod. She was standing at the edge of the room, her wool shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, a bundle of clean-pressed shirts balanced in her arms that she had just delivered to Cobb's counter. She was 19 years old. Her name was Nora Fitch. And when Del Barker said that Holt Greer had died quiet, with nobody watching, something moved across her face that was not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but some combination of the two that settled into her jaw and stayed there. She did not say anything. She picked up her empty basket, nodded to Cobb for the record of payment, and walked out into the cold. Nora Fitch had been doing laundry in Iron Creek for 2 years, since her mother died, which was the year after her father died, which was 3 years after the last of his crops failed so completely that the failure itself became a kind of local landmark, a reference point. The year everything went wrong for the Fitch family on the south edge of the valley. Would you treat them with kindness? She was 19 now and had been living alone in a rented room behind the boarding house since she was 17, which was young, but not as young as it sounds when you understand that Nora had been the person holding the household together since she was 14, quietly and without complaint, in the way that certain people simply absorb necessity without announcing it. She was not beautiful by the standards of Iron Creek, which is to say she was not delicate, not willowy, not the kind of woman whose wrists looked fragile in a man's hand. She was broad-shouldered and solid, with the kind of build that spoke of years of actual work, rather than the performance of domesticity. Her hands were calloused, her forearms were strong. She wore her brown hair pinned back under a bonnet when she was out, and a wool dress that had been let out and taken in, and let out again, as her body did what bodies do, and leather boots that she resoled herself with a borrowed awl when the original soles wore through. Iron Creek had opinions about Nora Fitch. Iron Creek had opinions about most things, but its opinions about Nora Fitch had a particular texture, the texture of a verdict that had been delivered early and never revisited. She was too much, too broad, too plain, too present, in a way that women were not supposed to be present. She did not diminish herself at the edges, did not make herself smaller in doorways or quieter at counters, did not look away with the particular downward cast of eyes that the women of Iron Creek had collectively agreed was the correct expression for a woman in her position. Virginia Pryce had made her opinions known in that careful, deniable way that Virginiable was Virginia Pryce's signature. She never said anything direct. She never said anything you could point to and call cruel. She simply had a way of pausing before she acknowledged Nora in public that lasted half a beat too long, a way of letting her eyes travel over Nora's figure with a small, unconscious adjustment of her own posture, as though proximity to Nora required a certain straightening of the spine to maintain one's own sense of proportion. Virginia Pryce was 45 years old and the wife of the only banker in Iron Creek. She wore silk day dresses with careful bustle work and gloves, even in the general store, and a wool cloak lined with something soft that nobody else in Iron Creek owned. She was not cruel in the way that coarse people are cruel. She was cruel in the way that powerful people are cruel, which is to say, she almost never had to do anything herself. She had Del Barker for the things that required a louder instrument, It was Del who had called Nora names in the street when she was 15. Del who had, 2 years ago, on a hot summer evening when he'd had too much of whatever someone's corn whiskey passed for spirits, positioned himself between Nora and the well, and made a performance of struggling to fit beside her in the narrow space. Would you treat them with kindness? Announcing the difficulty to his companions with the kind of grin that required an audience to function. Virginia Pryce had been standing outside her husband's bank across the street, had watched, had said nothing, had, when she caught Nora's eye across the distance, simply turned and walked inside. That was Virginia Pryce. Would you treat them with kindness? But the thing about Nora Fitch, the thing that Iron Creek had collectively failed to account for in all its verdicts and assessments, and the particular way it arranged itself around her absence from its social calendar, was that Nora Fitch had a memory like bedrock. She did not forget. She did not forgive, exactly, but she set things aside in the way that a person who intends to survive sets things aside, filed away in the dark interior where she kept all the accounts that mattered. She kept the account of every kindness, too. There had not been many, but the ones that existed, she kept with the same precision. The most important one had happened on a Tuesday in August, 6 months before the winter that swallowed Holt Greer. Nora had been at the public well on the east side of the settlement, working the handle to fill the buckets she would need for the next day's washing. The evening had been warm and still. She remembered the quality of the light, gold going amber, the way the mountains to the west had turned purple in the shadow of the sing-sun. Del Barker and 3 others had come out of Cobb's store with their evening's provisions and whatever passed for their evening's entertainment, and the entertainment had, as it occasionally did, settled on Nora. It started with comments. It always started with comments. Observations about space and size, and the structural integrity of the well's edge under certain pressures. His companions laughed in the way that men laugh when they are not sure something is funny but cannot afford to be the one who doesn't. And then it escalated because that was the logic of these things. And a stone, not large but large enough, came from somewhere in Del's vicinity and caught her on the upper arm. And then another. Nora had not run. Would you treat them with kindness? She had learned long before that running changed nothing except the direction you were facing when the next thing happened. She had stood her ground at the well and bled quietly through the sleeve of her dress and waited for it to be over. And then the shadow fell across everything. She had not heard him come out of the store, but Holt Greer was suddenly there, which was the only way to describe it, because a man that large did not so much arrive at a location as alter it. He was enormous in the way that certain things in nature are enormous, not aggressively, not as a performance, but simply as a fact that the surrounding space had to reorganize itself around. 6 feet and 4 inches of mountain man in a canvas coat, worn soft with years of use, wide-brimmed felt hat, cowhide boots that left prints in the summer dust, large enough to make grown men reassess their own footprint in the world. He had looked at Del Barker and Del Barker's companions with an expression that contained no anger and no threat in any conventional sense. It was something older than anger, something that the 3 men facing him recognized, some animal part of them that predated language and civilization, recognized as the particular quality of attention from something that could end you without exerting itself. He had not said much. 4 words, spoken in a voice that was low enough to be private and carried anyway. Get on your horses. They had gotten on their horses. He had not watched them go. He had walked to where Nora was standing at the well, still holding the bucket handle, still bleeding, and he had sat down on the stone edge of the well with the careful deliberateness of a large man who has learned to be conscious of furniture. Would you treat them with kindness? And he had looked not at her but at the middle distance, at nothing in particular look, in the way that people look when they are giving you the courtesy of not being examined while you collect yourself. She had not cried. She had thought she might, in the first moment, but the tears had not come, and then the moment had passed, and what was left was something rawer and stranger than crying. He had spoken without turning his head. The words had come out rough and unhurried, like something he had thought before, but never said aloud. Don't let them convince you that you're not worth keeping alive, girl. That's the only real damage they can do. Only if you believe it too. Then he had stood up, put on his hat, which he had removed to sit, though she had not noticed him doing it, and walked back into Cobb's general store to complete whatever errand had brought him to town that day. She had stood at the well for a long time after he left. She had carried those words, the way you carry something you did not know you needed until someone hands it to you, and suddenly you cannot imagine having gone without it. Would you treat them with kindness? She turned them over in her mind in the evenings when the settlement was quiet, and her small rented room behind the boarding house held nothing but the sound of wind and the small circle of light from her tallow candle. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about them when Virginia Pryce let her gaze travel over Nora's figure with that particular adjustment of posture. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about them when Del Barker made his productions in the street or at Cobb's counter. Don't let them convince you that you're not worth keeping alive. Would you treat them with kindness? She had thought about them in March, standing at the edge of Cobb's general store with a bundle of clean shirts, and the news that Holt Greer was probably dead and nobody was going to look for him, and she had felt something break inside her, that she did not have a precise name for, but that felt in the breaking, like a decision being made. The walk back to her room that evening was the same walk she took every day, past the boarding house with its warm yellow windows, past the church with its plain wooden cross catching the last gray light, past the frozen horse trough and the blacksmith's dark forge, and the corner where Virginia Pryce's husband's bank sat with its closed face and its opinion of everyone who wasn't a depositor. The cold was honest that evening at least, which was more than could be said for most of Iron Creek. It was the kind of cold that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. Nora walked through it and did not think about the cold. She was thinking about the mountain. She was thinking about the fact that Holt Greer had come down from that mountain twice a year, regular as a season, for 20 years. Spring and fall, never winter, never deep summer. Twice a year for supplies and trade, and whatever counted as human contact for a man who had arranged his life around its scarcity. And now it was March, which was neither spring nor fall, and he had not come down in 10 weeks, and the only person in Iron Creek who had thought this worth more than a shrug was currently walking home through the cold with her boots making small firm sounds on the frozen ground. She sat at her small table that night with her ledger of expenses and her tallow candle, wan and calm, and she did the kind of arithmetic that had nothing to do with numbers. She thought about the mountain. She thought about the passes, which were treacherous but not impassable now that March had softened the worst of the ice. She thought about the 4 days it would take to reach the elevation where Holt kept his cabin, assuming the trail held, assuming the weather held, assuming she could manage the last 2,000 feet on foot, after the horse gave out, which it would. She thought about what she would find when she got there. She did not let herself think too hard about the version of what she would find that involved arriving too late. She took a piece of paper and wrote, "Find Holt Greer." Then she folded the paper and put it in the pocket of her apron and blew out the candle and went to sleep in her narrow bed with the wind working at the gaps in the boarding house wall and her mind already 3,000 feet up the mountain, moving. She did not tell anyone. This was not because she feared they would stop her. Would you treat them with kindness? It was because she understood, with the precision of someone who had been invisible to a community for long enough to observe it clearly, that announcing her intention would transform it from a decision into a spectacle, and a spectacle into an argument. Would you treat them with kindness? And an argument into the kind of public deliberation that Iron Creek excelled at, and that accomplished nothing except the exhaustion of the person who had originally wanted to do something. She rose before dawn on a Thursday morning in early April. The sky was still dark, that deep blue-black of pre-dawn that contains the memory of night, and the settlement was quiet enough that her footsteps in the snow were the loudest sound she could hear. She had her wool dress, her leather boots, her warmest shawl doubled under her wool coat. She had rope and a hunting knife borrowed from a hook in the barn of the man who owed her 6 weeks of laundry money, a debt he had shown no urgency in settling. Would you treat them with kindness? She had dried meat and cornmeal and the small paper packet of herbs and poultices that her mother had taught her to use for fever and infection. Would you treat them with kindness? Knowledge passed down with the matter-of-fact and practicality of women who understood that the nearest doctor was a 2-day ride in good weather. The horse she borrowed from the same barn. Old Garrett's gray mare, thick through the middle, and slow but steady. The kind of horse that did not spook at shadows or sudden sounds. Which was the kind of horse you wanted for a trail that would require decisions at bad angles. She left a note in the barn for Garrett, telling him she'd have the mare back in a week. She did not say where she was going. Would you treat them with kindness? She rode out of Iron Creek in the dark with the mountains rising black and enormous to the west and the settlement sleeping behind her, and she did not look back. The first day was the easiest, which was not saying much. The trail that climbed from the valley floor into the lower slopes of the Iron Creek Range was marked, more or less, by the passage of the few men who used it. Holt himself had worn the deepest groove in it. 20 years of twice-annual passage, leaving a memory in the earth that even a hard winter could not entirely erase. Nora followed the groove where she could see it, which was not always, and trusted the shape of the slope when she couldn't. Would you treat them with kindness? The mare moved with the resignation of an animal that has lived long enough to accept that the people holding the reins will sometimes have ideas that seem inadvisable. The snow at the lower with kindness. The snow at the lower elevations had softened into a slurry in the afternoons, the kind of wet, heavy snow that pulled at the horse's legs and soaked through the leather of Nora's boots in the places where the stitching had begun to separate at the toe. She had patched those seams twice. She told herself they would hold. They held. By midday she was at 3,000 feet, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees and the snow had firmed back into something more manageable and less honest about how cold it actually was. She stopped to water the mare at a stream that was running clear and fast along the bottom of a small ravine, one of the few streams at this elevation that had not frozen completely, fed by some underground source that kept it moving through the worst of the winter. She ate a small amount of the dried meat. She did not stop for long. The trail steepened in the afternoon. The pines closed in on either side, dark and heavy with accumulated snow, their branches occasionally releasing loads that fell with a soft concussive sound that was nothing and sounded like something. Nora's back ached from the hours in the saddle. Her hands inside her gloves were stiff with cold. She thought about Holt Greer sitting at the bottom of the well-stone edge and looking at the middle distance, giving her the courtesy of not being examined. She kept moving. She made camp that first night at roughly 4,000 feet, where the trail crossed a small natural clearing, and the wind was partially blocked by a granite outcropping to the north. She built a fire with the competence of someone who had grown up building fires, not as a skill to be proud of, but as a simple necessity. And she heated water in the small tin pot she'd brought and dissolved a portion of cornmeal into it and ate, sitting close to the flames with her boots off and her feet as near to the heat as she could manage without scorching the wool of her stockings. The mare stood tethered to a pine 12 feet away and breathed slowly and regarded Nora with the mild, long-suffering expression of a horse that has decided to reserve judgment. The night sounds of the mountain were different from the night sounds of the valley. Down in Iron Creek, the sounds of night were human sounds, the settling of houses, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional voice raised and then quieted. Up here there was the wind in the upper branches, and the sharp crack of cold wood contracting and, once, from somewhere in the darkness to the east, a sound that Nora identified after a frozen moment as the call of a great horned owl, and chose to continue identifying as a great horned owl, even as it moved through the trees, and the trees went quiet around its passage. She slept badly and woke before dawn, and broke camp with numb fingers and kept moving. Day 2 brought the elevation where the horse could no longer manage the trail. She had expected this. The snow was deeper here, uncompacted, reaching the mare's belly in the worst sections, and the clay trail had narrowed to a seam between rock faces that would have been difficult for a loaded horse, even in good conditions. Nora found a stand of young aspens set back from the trail where the mare could stand out of the worst of the wind, and she tethered the horse with enough rope to move and enough dried grass from the pack to last 2 days, and she took everything she could carry on her back, and she left the horse there, and she walked. She was not a small woman. She had the build for this kind of work, which did not mean the work was not hard. The pack pulled at her shoulders. The snow was thigh-deep in places. The snow required a kind of deliberate high-stepping motion that burned through the muscles of her legs within the first hour. She set her jaw and she went up. The trail was harder to follow, without the groove the horse's hooves would have sought. She lost it twice and had to backtrack, reading the shape of the slope and the position of the sun, which was thin and pale and not particularly helpful. Would you treat them with kindness? Until she found the path again by logic and stubbornness and the faint memory of the descriptions she had heard over the years of the route that Holt Greer used to come down from his mountain. She thought, climbing, about what she would say to him. She thought about what he would say to her. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about his face when he had sat at the edge of the well, the weathered lines of it, the jaw rough with beard, the eyes that had looked at the middle distance and then, just once, had looked at her with something in them that she had not been able to name at the time and had thought about many times since. Not pity. Something clearer than pity. Something that saw her without the overlay of Iron Creek's verdict. She slept the second night pressed against a granite face that had retained some small residual warmth from the thin afternoon sun, her wool coat wrapped tight, the fire small and close, every sound in the darkness enormous and precise. She was tired in a way that she had not been tired before, a tiredness that went past the muscles and into something more fundamental, and she could feel the cold making proposals to her body that she declined, one by one, through the night, by feeding the fire and moving her feet and refusing to let her eyes stay closed longer than she intended. Dawn on the third day was pale and slow, and she was already moving before it fully arrived. She found the blood on the afternoon of the fourth day. Would you treat them with kindness? She had been climbing through a stand of pines so dense that the light came through in columns, dust thick with ice crystals, and the snow on the ground here was marked differently than elsewhere, disturbed in patterns that her eye caught before her mind had processed what it was seeing. She stopped. She looked, dark stain on the white ground, old enough to have gone brown at the edges, oxidized, days old rather than hours. Not fresh, not, she told herself carefully, necessarily recent. She followed it. It led her through the pines and up a short rock face and into a clearing she recognized, though she had never been there, recognized it the way you recognize a place that has been described to you enough times to build a picture. The enormous old pine at the clearing's edge, its roots exposed and grasping, its trunk wider than two men's arm span. The rock outcropping to the south that blocked the worst of the north wind. And there, in the shelter formed by the tree's bulk and the rock, wrapped in a canvas blanket and what she understood immediately was a bear's hide, was Holt Greer. She stood at the clearing's edge for one moment that was neither long nor short, a moment outside of normal duration. And then she would treat them with kindness, and then she was moving across the snow toward him with the deliberate controlled speed of someone who cannot afford to panic, because panic uses up things she cannot replenish here. She dropped to her knees beside him. He was not dead. The evidence of this was faint but unmistakable, the shallow movement of his chest under the hide, the small cloud of vapor that formed and dissipated above his mouth in the cold air. She catalogued the damage with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had dealt with injury in circumstances where there was no one else to deal with it. His left leg was splinted with bark strips and cloth wrapped tightly from thigh to ankle. His upper body, where the flannel shirt had been cut away and replaced with wrapped cloth, showed bandaging that had not been changed in what appeared to be weeks. The cloth stained in gradients of brown to yellow that she recognized as infected, deeply infected, the kind of infection that had already held its own internal conversation with his body about who was winning. His face was gaunt, gray under the dark beard, the broad familiar architecture of it reduced by weeks of fever and starvation to something stark, the bones closer to the surface, the eyes, when they opened, unfocused and slow to arrive. The eyes opened. 1 second they were closed. The next they were open, and she was looking into them, and they were looking into her, and there was a lag, a delay, some part of him that was still in the fever country, trying to navigate back to the world of faces and names, and the meaning of a person appearing above you in the snow. Then, Nora. His voice was a wreck, barely a voice at all. Gravel and rust and the effort of a man using equipment that had not been used in some time. Nora Fitch. Her chest tightened as the words came out before she could shape them. I came to find you. He moved. His hand came up with a speed that surprised her given everything else, and closed around her wrist, the grip weak by his standards she suspected but firm enough to stop her motion. His eyes had found focus now, and what was in them was not gratitude. It was something she had not expected, something that looked, in the strange honest light of a clearing at 8,000 feet in the mountains, like shame. Don't. His chest was laboring with the effort of speech, each word arriving separately. Don't waste your work on this. Let me go, Nora. I've been waiting on it. Let me finish. She looked at his face. She looked at the grip on her wrist. She looked at the infected bandaging and the splintered leg and the bare hide that had kept him alive through weeks of mountain winter by virtue of nothing except some stubborn animal core of him that had not yet agreed to stop. She said what came to her. You told me the only real damage is if I believe it too. His grip did not loosen, but it did not tighten. She continued, not cruelly, not gently, but in the level tone of someone making a case that matters. You sat at that well and you told me not to let them convince me I wasn't worth keeping alive. I've been carrying that since August. I carried it up 4 days of mountain in the worst winter. This territory's seen in 30 years. And you're going to lay here in this clearing and tell me you're not worth the same consideration you gave me? The wind moved through the upper branches of the pine above them. Ice crystals fell in a thin silver curtain. Holt Greer's hand released her wrist. He did not speak, but he turned his face away. Would you treat them with kindness? And she understood this as the only concession she was going to get from a man who had arranged 20 years of his life around not needing anything from anyone. And she accepted it as the concession it was, and she went to work. She built the fire first because everything else required heat. Dry kindling from the dead lower branches of the pine, larger wood from the fallen birch at the clearing's east edge, the fire built in the stone circle that Holt had constructed. She saw, weeks ago, with the instinct of a man who even in extremity knew how to arrange his survival. She heated water in her tin pot, and when it was hot enough she began to remove his bandaging. He made sounds as she worked, not words. The involuntary sounds of pain that a man makes when he has given up trying to hide from pain because there is no one watching, or rather when the person watching has, through some quality she could not have named, stopped counting as an audience. She worked steadily. Her hands did not shake. She had not known they would not shake until they did not, and this steadiness surprised her and then simply became the fact of the work. The wounds were bad. The bear had caught him along the left side of his upper body. 3 deep parallel gashes that had closed and reopened and closed again over weeks, and the closure was not clean, was ragged and hot to the touch, and the smell of infection was honest and serious. Would you treat him with kindness? She cleaned each wound with the hot water and the cloth she tore from the hem of her dress without deliberating about it, and she applied the poultice her mother had taught her, yarrow and golden seal ground, with a small amount to a paste, with a small amount of water, and she wrapped the wounds in fresh strips of cloth from the extra shirt in her pack. Would you treat them with kindness? She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, stopping to feed the fire, stopping to bring Holt water and hold his head while he drank, stopping to assess the leg. Which you treat them with kindness, which the splinting had addressed as well as could be managed under the circumstances and which she decided to leave alone since moving it would cost more than it would gain. He slipped in and out of the fever country as the afternoon went dark. She heard him there, in the language of the place, the words that came loose when the conscious mind stopped guarding the door. He spoke about Anne. He said the name twice, then more, and sometimes he spoke to her directly, and Nora heard in his voice something she had not heard when he had spoken at the well, a quality of openness that the waking Holt Greer had not permitted himself, a rawness that made her look away even though he could not see her looking. He spoke about a child, brief, fragmented, enough, She understood then, in the way you understand things that you have not been told, but that arrive anyway through the accumulation of small evidence, why Holt Greer had gone to his mountain. Not for the freedom of it, not for the solitude of it, though he had made use of both. He had gone because he believed, somewhere in the inaccessible interior of himself, that he had forfeited the right to the company of other people, that whatever had happened with Anne and the child had marked him as someone to whom the ordinary satisfactions of life did not apply. He had called it living. She recognized it, now, as the other thing. She did not sleep that night. She fed the fire and checked on Holt and listened to the mountain, and heard things in the darkness that she assessed carefully and did not allow to become more than what they were. At some point in the deep middle of the night the wind dropped entirely, and the silence was so complete she could hear her own blood. She thought, I am here, on this mountain, in this clearing. She thought, nobody in Iron Creek knows where I am. She thought, good. The second night was harder. Holt's fever climbed in a way that alarmed her, his temperature visible in the flush of his face, even in the firelight, and she spent that night alternating cold compresses against his forehead, with careful small doses of the willow bark tea she brewed in her tin pot. Would you treat them with kindness? Sitting close enough to respond to any change, watching his chest for the rhythm of his breathing, the way you watch something you cannot afford to lose track of. He was quieter the second night, less present, which was not the direction she wanted, but was the direction the fever had chosen. Would you treat them with kindness? She talked to him, because her mother had told her once that people in fever could sometimes hear more than they showed, and because the silence of the mountain at 3 a.m. was the kind of silence that pushed back against you if you let it. She told him about Iron Creek, about the difficulty of running a laundry service in winter when the water sources froze, and you had to melt snow in large quantities to get enough water for even a single day's work. About her father's farm in the years when it had produced things, the specific color of a wheat field in August going gold. About the books she had read that her father had traded for, piece by piece, from travelers passing through them, until the pages separated from the bindings, and she had sewn the bindings back with whatever thread was available. She did not know if he heard any of it. She talked anyway. The third day the fever broke in the morning, a long gradual subsidence, rather than a dramatic moment, the flush fading from his face, his breathing deepening and regularizing, the sweat coming and then stopping as his body arrived at some new equilibrium that was not health exactly, but was distance from the edge. Nora had been awake for 3 days. She had not counted them as they passed, but she counted them now, sitting against her rock with the fire going, and Holt's chest rising and falling with something that resembled ease, and she felt the counting as a physical weight. She let herself sleep. The sun was different when she opened her eyes. Lower, further west, the day considerably advanced. She had slept for hours. The fire had burned down to coals and was recoverable. Holt was still breathing. The clearing was still there. The mountain had not rearranged itself while she was unconscious. She sat up, and her neck screamed where she had been resting against the rock, at an angle that the rock had not been designed for. She moved her head carefully and looked across the fire at Holt Greer. He was awake. Not the partial waking of the fever, the off-focused opening and closing of eyes that had happened intermittently over the past days. He was awake in the full sense, present in his eyes, his gaze moving with intelligence and clarity from the fire to the shelter above him, to the clearing around them, to her face. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way a man looks at something when he is trying to understand what it means. He looked at her hands, raw and blistered, the cloth wrapping around the worst of the left one where she'd caught the edge of a stone in the dark of the second night. He looked at her face, which she knew without looking was gaunt, in a way it had not been 4 days ago, hollowed by cold and wakefulness. He looked at the collapsed awkward angle she had been sleeping in against the rock. He looked at the fire, which she had built them with kindness, which she had built and maintained for 3 days, and the shelter above him, which she had reinforced with additional pine boughs, and the cleared area of snow around their camp perimeter, and the organized arrangement of her supplies. and all the small and large evidence of 3 days of another person's sustained effort on his behalf. His throat moved. He reached for the water skin she had placed near his head and found it and drank from it, which told her that whatever strength was returning to him was enough for that, at least. Then, in the wrecked voice that was beginning to acquire slightly more volume, "How long?" "4 days up the mountain," Nora answered. 3 days here. He absorbed this. She watched him do it, watched him apply the arithmetic to himself, to what those numbers meant about his condition when she had arrived, and what she had done in those 3 days, and what it had cost to do it. Something moved through with kindness, moved through his face then that she could not categorize precisely, that did not belong to the vocabulary of expressions she had catalogued in her 19 years of watching people's faces, because they had not known she was watching. It was not gratitude, exactly, though that was in it. It was something older and stranger than gratitude, something that looked, from where she sat against her rock on the 4th morning at 8,000 feet in the mountains, like a man who had been gone a very long time and had just noticed, for the first time in 20 years, that someone had left the light on. The wind came down from the peaks and moved through the pines above them, with a sound like a long, slow exhalation, and the smoke from Nora's fire rose straight up for a moment in the brief stillness, and then bent west, toward the valley, toward Iron Creek, toward the settlement that did not know she was here and had not looked for either of them. Would you treat them with kindness? She reached into her pack and found the dried meat and the remaining cornmeal, and she began making what could pass for a meal, her hands moving with the competence of a woman who has learned to feed people with whatever is available, and the fire cracked and settled, and Holt Greer lay in his shelter of pine boughs and bare hide and watched her work with an expression that he might not have known was on his face, that she did not point out to him. That was how it started. Not with words, not with declarations, but with a fire and a tin pot, and the particular quality of being seen by someone who had come a very long way, and through a very great deal specifically to see you. Neither of them said anything more that afternoon. The mountain said enough. The 5th morning on the mountain arrived the way most mornings at that elevation, arrived in April, without ceremony, without warmth, the darkness simply thinning by degrees, until the pines resolved from black shapes into green ones and the snow caught the first gray light and held it. Nora was already awake. She had been awake for an hour, feeding the fire back from coals, her breath coming in small visible clouds, her fingers moving through the familiar motions of tending a flame that had become, over these past days, something close to a living responsibility. Holt was watching her. She had noticed this the previous afternoon and had chosen not to acknowledge it, in the same way she had chosen not to acknowledge many things in her 19 years of being looked at wrongly or not looked at all. But this was different from those other varieties of observation. This was not the sliding inventory of Virginia Pryce's gaze or the performative attention of Del Barker looking for material. This was something quieter and more serious. Would you treat them with kindness? The attention of a man who had been somewhere else for a long time and was trying to take the measure of the distance between where he had been and where he currently found himself. She let him look. She was making what the morning's provisions allowed, cornmeal with a strip of dried meat crumbled into it, heated in the tin pot, not enough to satisfy, but enough to constitute the intention of a meal. Would you treat them with kindness? The altitude had taken the edge off her own hunger, which she knew from her father's descriptions of high mountain work, the way thin air quieted the body's demands for fuel even as it increased the body's consumption of it. She ate her portion carefully, measuring it against what remained, and how many more days she might need the supplies to last. Holt's voice, when it came, had recovered some of its lower register. Still rough, still carrying the texture of weeks of disuse and fever, but fuller than the day before, the way a fire sounds fuller when it has adequate wood. You need to eat more than that. She looked up. His eyes were clear in the morning light, the fever's residue gone from them, replaced by something alert and assessing. She noted the change and what it meant for his recovery, and set that note beside the other things she was tracking. "I'm calculating the supplies," she answered, which was true, and also a refusal to discuss the subject further, two things that were not incompatible. He did not push it. He accepted the portion she brought him and ate it without comment, sitting up against the root of the great pine, with the careful deliberateness of a man relearning the geography of his own body. He was still pale. The muscles of his face, which she imagined had held a particular kind of set authority when he was well, were doing something more tentative now, as though every expression required more negotiation than it used to. But he was sitting up. He was eating. He was tracking the world around him with eyes that worked. Progress had a shape, even at 8,000 feet. He asked her, between slow, careful spoonfuls, how she had found the trail. She told him, in the efficient way she told most things, the practical facts of the route, where she had left the mare, which stand of aspens, how many days. He listened with kindness. He listened without interrupting, which was the kind of listening that cost something from the listener, the kind that required the listener to set down their own thoughts and wait. When she finished, he said nothing immediately. He turned the empty tin in his large hands, the tin small in them, almost comically small, a child's object in the grip of a man built on a different scale than ordinary objects. Then nobody else came. It was not a question, but it held a question inside it, the way a fist can hold something without opening. Nobody else came, Nora confirmed. He nodded once. The nod of a man receiving information he had already known, but had needed to hear confirmed in order to place it correctly in the larger accounting he was conducting of his own life and its contents. That afternoon she made him move. Not far. Not ambitiously. Would you treat them with kindness? She needed to assess the leg, which required him to be in a position other than the one he had occupied for the past weeks. And she needed the assessment because the leg was the variable that would determine everything about the journey back down the mountain. Would you treat them with kindness? She explained this to him in the same efficient way she explained most things, and he received it in the way he seemed to receive most things, with a nod that conceded the logic without necessarily embracing the experience of it. Getting him upright was the first real measure of what they were dealing with. He was, as she had known abstractly and now understood concretely, enormous. Not simply tall, but constructed on a different premise than ordinary men. Would you treat them with kindness? The width of his shoulders and the depth of his chest and the sheer mass of him, a fact that you could know about someone intellectually and still find surprising in the moment of encountering it as a physical problem to be solved. Would you treat them with kindness? She positioned herself at his right side, her shoulder under his arm, and felt his weight settle against her that the mathematics of this arrangement required her to be considerably more than she would normally need to be. She was. Barely. But barely was enough. He made a sound through his teeth when the leg took any weight at all, a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, and was clearly the sound of a man who had decided against making the actual sound the pain wanted him to make. He went white along the jaw. She did not comment on this. She held steady and let him find his balance and waited. The splint held, she told him, looking at his leg rather than his face. The bone set reasonably straight. You'll walk on it, not today. Tell me what you see, she told him. The gashes from the bear were healing, the infection responding to the poultice, the worst of the fever's damage reflected in his weight loss rather than his wounds, which had been serious enough without that additional arithmetic. The leg was the long problem. Weeks before it could take his full weight. Weeks they did not have, if they were going to get down the mountain before the next serious weather came through. He sat back against the pine and she felt him doing the same calculation she had been doing, the one with the weeks and the supplies and the distance and the terrain, and she watched him arrive at the same answer she had. I can't walk it, he said. This was not self-pity. It was the flat declaration of a man who had spent 20 years making accurate assessments of situations and understood that inaccurate assessments in the mountains cost more than pride. Not yet, she was already working through the modifications. We can make a sling brace for the leg. Distribute your weight differently. Take it in stages. She paused. It will be slow. How slow? 4 days down instead of 4 days up, maybe 5. He looked at the mountains above them, the peaks still white, the sky between them the hard blue of high altitude in early spring. Would you treat them with kindness? She watched him look and understood that he was looking at the weather as much as the landscape, reading the signs she had been reading for days, the cloud formation to the northwest, the wind direction, the particular them with kindness, clarity of the air that in these mountains meant either stable weather or the hour before it became the opposite. 5 days is possible, he said finally. If the weather holds. The weather will hold for 3. After that I'm less certain. He looked at her then, a full direct look that she met without adjusting her posture or her expression. And something moved in his eyes that she filed in the same place she had filed the look from the well in August, the place where she kept the things that mattered and that she had not yet decided what to do with. He said, "You read weather." "My father farmed," she answered, as though this explained everything, which it did. They spent the rest of the afternoon constructing the modifications she had described. She had rope, and he had the knowledge of the mountain, and between these two resources they made something workable, a brace that would allow him to bear partial weight on the left leg with support, that could be adjusted as the terrain required, that was not elegant, but was functional, in the way that things constructed from necessity rather than design are often functional, with a directness and honesty that designed things sometimes lack. Would you treat them with kindness? He guided her hands when the construction required 2 functional legs and a knowledge of knots she did not have, talking her through each step in the low, unhurried voice she was beginning to understand was simply how he spoke, not the economy of a taciturn man, but the precision of a man who had learned that words worked better in smaller quantities. She followed his instructions exactly and did not try to improvise. She had learned early that following exact instructions in situations you did not fully understand produced better outcomes than creative interpretation. When they were done, he tested the brace, standing with it for 30 seconds, his hand on the pine trunk for stability, his jaw doing the thing it had done before. Then he sat back down and said, "It'll work." She took that as the equivalent of effusive praise and set about making the evening meal. The days that followed established a rhythm that was nothing like comfort, but had the bones of it. Holt's recovery was not linear. Would you treat them with kindness? There were mornings he was better than the evening before, and there were mornings he had gone backward in the night, the body doing its accounting in the dark, and arriving at numbers that were less favorable than the morning before. She tracked these fluctuations with the same careful attention she had brought to the initial assessment, adjusting the poultice, adjusting the willow bark tea, adjusting the distribution of food based on what his body seemed to require on a given day. Would you treat them with kindness? He watched her do all of this with an attention that was different from the observation of the first days, less the attention of a man trying to understand what he was seeing. Would you treat them with kindness? More the attention of a man who had understood and was now watching the thing itself, the way a person watches something they have recognized as remarkable without yet knowing what to do with the recognition. He began talking on the 3rd day in the clearing, which was the 7th day of her being on the mountain, and the talking was not the fever country language of the first days. It was deliberate, chosen. Would you treat them with kindness? As though he had made a decision in the night to exchange certain things he had kept for a long time, and had decided that she was the person he was willing to exchange them with. He told her about Anne without preamble, without positioning it, simply beginning one afternoon while Nora was sorting through the remnants of the medical supplies to assess what remained. My wife's name was Anne. Nora set down what she was holding and gave him the same thing he had given her at the well. She looked at the middle distance. She waited. We came west in 1799. I had a notions about land, and she had a notion about what we could make of it. She was smarter than the notion, but she loved me enough to follow it anyway. He paused. He was looking at the peaks. I was trapping 40 miles north when she went into labor. Came back to find the 2 of them already gone. The baby had been early. There was no one close enough to send for, and nothing to send for even if there had been. Nora did not say she was sorry. She had been on the receiving end of enough hollow condolence to understand that it was more for the speaker than for the persons being spoken to. What she said was, "How long ago?" 22 years. She did the arithmetic quietly. He had been on this mountain for 22 years. Not because he had chosen solitude as a preference, because he had chosen it as a sentence. You went to the mountain instead of going back east. Couldn't go back. The words were level with kindness. The words were level and examined, the words of a man who had thought about this enough that they had stopped carrying their original jagged edges. Going back meant being the man whose wife and child died while he was 40 miles away, choosing the wrong thing to be 40 miles away doing. Staying here, at least the mountain didn't know about that man. The wind moved. The fire shifted. Nora looked at the place on the ground between them and thought about what he had just given her and what it required in return. She said, "I've been invisible my whole life. Not in the way that gets you sympathy, in the way that gets you nothing. My father looked at me and saw his only child, but also saw the son he didn't have, and those two things together made him look sideways at me, like I was an apology for something. My mother loved me the way you love something fragile, even though I was never fragile. After they were both gone, the town looked at me and saw someone who didn't fit the measurements they used for women and decided that meant I was less than the measurements. Not wrong, not bad, just less." She had not said any of this aloud before. She had thought it, in the way she thought most things, precisely and without illusion. But she had not said it to another person, because there had not been another person it seemed worth saying it to. Holt was quiet for a time that had weight to it. Then, "You're not less." It was not an elaborate statement. It was not dressed with qualifiers or softened with poetry. It was a declarative sentence delivered with the same flatness he used for weather assessments and trail conditions, and it landed with the same authority. She looked at him. He was looking at her directly, not at the middle distance, and his eyes had in them the same thing she had filed from August and not yet known what to do with, and she understood now, looking at it straight on rather than in her memory of it, that what it was simply recognition. The plain, rare fact of being seen by someone who was looking at the thing itself, and not at what they expected the thing to be. She said, "You're not the man who chose wrong." Something in his face moved. She continued, because, having begun, she found the rest of it waiting in an orderly line, which surprised her since she had not known it was there. A man who chose wrong wouldn't have told a girl she was worth keeping alive. A man who chose wrong wouldn't have built this fire circle, wouldn't have splinted his own leg in a bear attack, and kept himself alive for 10 weeks alone at 8,000 feet. A man who chose wrong doesn't do those things. He does nothing. You didn't do nothing. The fire cracked. The sound was loud in the quiet, and then it wasn't. "How'd you treat them with kindness?" Holt turned his face away, and she saw the line of his jaw work, and she looked at the middle distance herself and gave him the same courtesy he had given her at the well, and they stayed like that for a while, the mountain holding still around them, the snow bright in the afternoon light. On the 9th morning, they began the descent. The going was precisely as difficult as she had calculated, and no worse, which she counted as a success. She had rigged the brace the night before and tested the configuration by having him stand on it in the clearing, adjusting the rope tension until the weight distribution was as favorable as she could make it. He bore it. Treat them with kindness? He bore it without complaint, which was not the same as bearing it without pain, a distinction she had learned to read in the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of his silences. She took the weight on his right side. The arrangement required her to be, for long stretches of trail, the structural element that kept him upright and moving forward. This was not a complaint she would have made and was not a fact she dwelt on, except insofar as it was information relevant to her own resource management. She was strong. She had always been strong, had been told by Iron Creek that this was at best a neutral quality in a woman and at worst a disqualifying one, and had filed that assessment in the place she kept things that were Iron Creek's problem rather than hers. Would you treat them with kindness? What she knew was that her strength was currently the variable that determined whether they made it down this mountain before the weather changed. So she was strong. The first day of descent, they made roughly 1,000 feet of elevation, which was slower than she had hoped and faster than she had feared, the terrain in the upper section being the most technical and the most demanding of the leg he could not fully use. He fell once, on a section of trail where the ice had not yet softened in the morning sun. the good leg going out from under him and the brace not catching fast enough, and it happened quickly, and she caught the worst of it but not all of it, and he sat in the snow for a full minute, with his eyes closed and his breathing controlled and deliberate in the way that is deliberate, because the alternative is not controlled. She waited. He opened his eyes and looked at her, standing in the snow beside him, her hands ready. He said, with a dryness she had not heard from him before, "Don't say anything." The corner of her mouth moved. Just the corner. "I wasn't going to." He made the sound that was not quite a laugh, a sound she catalogued as new and placed carefully. They made camp the first night at a rock shelf she had noted on the way up. Good shelter from the north, and the remains of a fire ring someone, possibly Holt himself on one of his annual descents, had built against the base of the rock. Would you treat them with kindness? She made the fire and the meal, and they sat on either side of the flames with the mountain above them and the valley invisible below, and ate in a silence that was different from the silences of the first days, less the silence of two people who did not yet know what to say, and more the silence of two people who had said some things and were sitting with what they had said. He told her about the mountain, not the practical geography of it, but the interior geography, the places on it that had meaning to him, the creek that ran through the lower meadow, seaful and filled with cutthroat trout in late spring, the high ridge that on clear days let you see east for 100 miles across the territory, the meadow below his cabin, where in June the wildflowers came up so thick you could not step without putting your boot in something purple or yellow or red. Would you treat them with kindness? He talked about these things with a precision and a feeling that she had not heard from him in the fever language of the first days, and she understood that this was the language he used for things that had actually mattered to him, the specific and careful language of a man for whom the mountain was not a backdrop, but a life. She told him about the books, not the titles or the arguments in them, but what they had been for her. In the small room in the boarding house, with the tallow candle and the wind at the gaps. Doors, she said, not meaning to use the word until she had used it. Books were doors she could go through when the particular quality of Iron Creek became too much of a ceiling. He understood this without requiring elaboration. The second day of descent was warmer, the sun stronger, the snow on the lower slopes, beginning the afternoon softening that made walking harder. They passed the rock face she had slept against. On the way up, the place she had noted the slight retained warmth of the stone, and she saw Holt look at it as they went by, assessing the evidence of her passage in the things she had left, the ash of the small fire. Would you treat them with kindness? The marks in the snow where she had arranged herself for sleep, and she watched him calculate from this evidence what the nights had been like and what it had taken to make them through. He did not say anything about it. But his arm, where it rested across her shoulders for balance, pressed, slightly, briefly, with a weight that was distinct from the weight of necessity, and she noted this and added it to the accounting she was keeping of small things that might add up to something larger. On the afternoon of the second day of descent she found the mare where she had left her, in the aspens, thinner but sound regarding Nora's return, with the philosophical resignation of a horse that has learned to have modest expectations. She was extravagantly glad to see the animal and did not try to conceal this, pressing her face into the mare's neck for a moment, while the horse stood politely and breathed. Holt watched this from the rock where he had settled to rest, and she felt him watching, and did not care. The lower 2 days were easier on the leg and harder on everything else. The trail was more traveled kindness, but the sun and better marked, but the sun had created the afternoon slurry she had dealt with on the way up, and it was slower and wetter and required more of both of them than the cleaner cold of the higher elevation. She put Holt on the mare for the sections where the trail allowed it, which meant walking alongside the horse at an altitude where she no longer needed to, which she did without calculation or announcement. He noticed. On the afternoon of the fourth day, the valley floor came into view below them, a small settlement in the cradle of the mountains, smoke rising from chimneys, the geometry of fenced fields and cabin rooftops, the church steeple catching the afternoon light. Iron Creek, proof of the ordinary world, sitting in its valley, going about its business with no idea what had been happening 4,000 feet above it. Holt stopped the mare and sat looking at it for a moment. She stood beside the horse and looked at it too. He said, and the words came out with a deliberateness that told her he had been thinking about how to say them. I said something to you once. At a well. I remember. I meant it. I mean it now. More than I did then, because then I was saying it out of what I saw, and now I'm saying it from what I know. He was looking at the valley still, not at her. What you did on that mountain, coming up there by yourself, staying, not leaving when I told you to, those 3 nights feeding the fire. A person can know their own worth in the abstract, as a principle, as the right thing to believe about yourself. It's another thing entirely to see it demonstrated from the outside, to have someone show you what you're worth by what they're willing to do. She waited. He looked at her then. Directly, in the afternoon light, the valley spread below them and the mountain above. I don't know how to say thank you for that. I know I owe you more than I can probably figure out how to pay. She thought about this. She thought about what she wanted to say and what she actually needed to say, which were sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. What she said was, you already started paying it. When you sat down at that well. They came into Iron with kindness. They came into Iron Creek in of the 4th day of descent, not by design but by the pace of what the terrain had allowed, and the light at that hour was the long gold of late afternoon going amber, the shadows stretching east from the pines at the settlement's edge, the smoke from the chimneys going straight up in the still air. Nobody was outside when they came down the main trail, or almost nobody. Would you treat them with kindness? There was a boy crossing between the blacksmith and the barn who looked up and stopped and stared with the open, uncomplicated stare of someone too young to have learned the local rules about who was worth staring at and who was not, and Nora nodded to him, and he nodded back and went on his way. But there was one person outside who was not a boy and who was not uncomplicated. Virginia Pryce was standing on the porch of her husband's bank with a shawl around her shoulders and the expression she wore when she was collecting information. She saw them come down the trail, Holt on the mare and Nora walking alongside, and Nora saw Virginia see them, and she saw Virginia's eyes move between the two of them with the particular, calculating quality that was Virginia at her most focused, and she watched Virginia make the assessment and file it. Virginia said nothing. She went inside. Would you treat them with kindness? Nora held that image and what it promised for later as she walked Holt to the building where she had quietly arranged, in the 2 weeks before she had gone up the mountain, that Walter Cobb would allow Holt the use of the small storeroom at the back of the general store should such a need arise. Would you treat them with kindness? An arrangement Cobb had agreed to with the good-natured practicality of a man who had known Holt Greer for 20 years and considered him a reasonable investment of goodwill. She helped Holt inside and got him settled, and she stood in the door of the storeroom for a moment looking at him, sitting on the cot Cobb had placed there, his canvas coat folded over the chair beside him, his felt hat on the hook by the door, a candle lit on the small table. He looked at her from the cot with the expression that was not easily named, the one she had added to the accounting. He said, "You're going back to your room." "Yes. And tomorrow I'll come back." She meant this as information rather than promise, though it contained both. There's more healing to do. He nodded then Nora. She waited. He could not find the rest of it, or chose not to, or found that the thing he had meant to say was large enough that the small space of the storeroom could not contain its full shape, and he let it go at the single word. And she understood that sometimes a person's name, said a certain way, carries everything the sentence was going to say and lets the other person receive it in the form that fits them best. She walked back through Iron Creek in the evening light, with her shawl around her shoulders and her hair unpinned for once, and the mountain behind her, enormous and calm and lit gold along its upper ridges by the last of the sun, and she did not think about Virginia Pryce standing on that porch with her calculating eyes. She thought about the mare in Garrett's barn, which needed tending. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about the supplies she would need tomorrow, and the day after, and the slow, careful work of bringing a man the rest of the way back from the edge he had spent 20 years arranging his life to fall off. And somewhere in the thinking, underneath it, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Something that was not hope in the romantic sense, not the breathless variety, but the older and more structural kind. The kind that does not require certainty in order to function. The kind that says this is worth continuing. Not because I know how it ends, but because what is happening here is real. The last of the light went from the mountain peaks as she reached the boarding house. She went inside and she did not look back. The mountain was still there when she didn't look. It was always there. And somewhere at 8,000 feet in the Iron Creek Range, a fire ring sat cold in a clearing by a great old pine, the ash of it still readable to anyone who came looking. Evidence of the 3 days and the 3 nights and the woman who had held the line of a man's life between her calloused hands and had not let go. Iron Creek went to sleep that night not knowing any of this. Virginia Pryce, in her silk nightgown in the large house beside the bank, lay awake and did know, or knew enough. Would you treat them with kindness, and was already can construct from what she knew something that would serve her purposes. This was the thing about small places with long memories and powerful women who had decided, for reasons that had never required examination, that certain people were best kept in their proper positions. They noticed everything, and they were never, not once, in any of the long complicated history of this or any other settlement, slow to act on what they noticed. The storeroom behind Cobb's General Store was not designed for a man of Holt Greer's dimensions. The ceiling cleared his head by 2 inches when he stood, which he did less often than he wanted to, and more often than the leg wanted him to. Would you treat them with kindness? Cobb was a foot short and he slept with his boots hanging off the end, which he did not complain about, because complaining required an audience, and he had spent 22 years making sure he did not have one. The single window faced east and let in the morning light at an angle that hit the floor rather than the wall, which meant the room brightened slowly and sideways, like a thought arriving at an angle you had not expected. Nora came every morning. This was not something they had negotiated or formalized. Would you treat them with kindness? It was something that had simply become true, in the way that certain arrangements become true not because anyone decided them, but because they fit the shape of what is actually needed, and so they persist. Would you treat them with kindness? She came in the morning with whatever she had been able to assemble from her own stores and from Cobb, who had extended credit in the careful way of a man who considered it both a practical and a moral investment, and she assessed the wounds and the leg and the state of things generally, and then she stayed for a portion of the morning before she went to whatever laundry work she had that day. The leg was the long arithmetic. It was healing, which was not in doubt, but healing at the pace that a complex injury heals when the person it belongs to is 48 years old and has spent the preceding 10 weeks in conditions that would have finished a man with less structural stubbornness. She changed the wrapping every 2 days. Would you treat them with kindness? She made him move the leg through the range of motion she had established would not damage the repair. A slow, deliberate exercise she had him perform morning and evening, watching his face for the information it provided about what the leg was experiencing that he would not volunteer. He bore the exercises with the grim cooperative resignation of a large animal that has decided to trust the person holding the rope, which she recognized as the significant concession. It was from a man who had spent 2 decades trusting nothing outside himself. What grew between them in those mornings was not easy to name, and she did not try to name it. Would you treat them with kindness? It was the thing that grows between people who have been through something extreme together and survived it, which is not necessarily love in the simple sense, but is something that contains love the way bedrock contains water, not as a surface feature, but as a structural presence you discover when you dig into the thing. They talked. They argued occasionally, always about something practical. The correct way to weight the brace, whether he was putting too much strain on the leg too early, once about whether the cornmeal she had brought was ground too coarse for what she was making, an argument he won on technical grounds and she won on results. Would you treat them with kindness? They were quiet together in a way that was different from being quiet alone. They read from the 2 books she had brought from her room, taking turns, she reading to him on the mornings when his energy ran low, he reading to her in the slow, deliberate voice of a man who had learned to read in solitude, and so read as though every sentence was a considered decision. Would you treat them with kindness? She found the miniature portrait on the 5th morning. It was in the canvas coat he had worn on the mountain. In the inner pocket, she had not searched because there was no medical reason to search it. It fell out when she picked up the coat to hang it properly. A small oval portrait no larger than her palm, painted on paper in careful miniature by someone with skill. A young woman's face, dark hair, a directness in the painted eyes that suggested the subject had found sitting for a portrait mildly inconvenient, but had agreed to it anyway. Nora picked it up, looked at it, set it on the table where Holt could reach it, face up, and did not comment. He saw her set it down. He did not say anything immediately. Then, Anne was 23 in that portrait. She had a frank face, Nora said, which was true, and was also the kind of observation that the subject would have appreciated. She suspected she would have liked you. He said this without looking at Nora, looking at the portrait. She had no patience for people who made themselves smaller to fit what other people wanted. She would have looked at you and been pleased. This was not a small thing to say. Nora understood it was not a small thing and received it accordingly, which meant she set it in the place, she was keeping the things that mattered, and moved on with the practical work of the morning so he would not have to watch her absorb it. The days in the storeroom accumulated. A week. Then 10 days. Then 2 weeks in which April moved through its middle and began to soften toward its end, the snow retreating upward into the higher elevations, the valley floor showing mud where the frozen ground was releasing its hold. Holt's color came back. The drawn quality of his face, the bones too prominent under the skin, began to fill in as appetite returned, and Nora kept the food coming with the systematic dedication of a woman who had identified a problem and assigned herself its solution. He began to move around Cobb's storeroom. Then he moved around the area behind the general store, slowly, with the brace, in the hour after Nora arrived, and before she left, for her laundry work. Cobb watched these perambulations from the back door with the expression of a man watching something he is glad to see happen and does not want to jinx by mentioning. It was on one of these late April mornings, a Tuesday, with the sun doing serious work for the first time since fall, and the mud in the main street of Iron Creek recording the passage of every boot and hoof in the territory, that Nora walked into the storeroom and found Holt standing at the east window looking out at the back of the settlement with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the pain expression, not the fever expression, not the careful measuring expression of a man assessing terrain. Something more complicated, something that had a border on it she could not precisely locate. She set down what she had brought and looked at him looking out the window and waited. He said, without turning, "You should know that people are talking." The inside of her chest did something that she categorized and set aside. People in Iron Creek talk about whatever is available. They're talking about you specifically, about the 3 months. Would you treat them with kindness? He turned from the window then, and his eyes had in them the directness that had always been there, but that was now carrying something additional, something that looked like guilt in the geography of it, guilt, or its close neighbor, about an unmarried woman alone with a man on a mountain for 3 months. About what that means. She met this information the way she met most uncomfortable information, by looking at it squarely. I know. Then you know what Virginia Pryce is saying. Virginia Pryce. The name had the weight of a dropped implement in a quiet room. I have a reasonable idea. He moved from the window to the chair beside the table, lowering himself into it with the careful deliberateness that the leg still required. He put his large forearms on the table and looked at them. Nora, I need you to hear me say this clearly. Whatever is being said about you out there is my fault. You came up that mountain to do the right thing, and you are paying for it in the currency that small places charge for doing things they would not have done themselves. She looked at him, at the large forearms on the table, at the set of his jaw, which had in it something she recognized as a man preparing to say something that was costing him something to say. What are you trying to tell me? He looked up, direct, the way he always was when it actually mattered. I'm trying to tell you that I would fix it if you would let me. That there's a way to answer what Virginia Pryce is saying that silences it permanently and gives you something you deserve to have. A name that Iron Creek recognizes. a position that its mathematics can accommodate. He stopped. Then, with the bare precision of a man who has stripped a thing down to its essential weight, I'm trying to tell you that I would marry you if you'd have me. Not as a transaction. Not as a debt I'm paying. Because I have looked at you every day for these past weeks, and I have not once looked away and not wanted to keep looking. The room held very still. Nora looked at the man sitting at the table, the large, battered, patient man who had sat at a well in August and given her the only thing she had carried through the winter. Would you treat them with kindness? And she understood that she was being offered something real, and that the offering was real, and that the fear in his eyes, which was there if you knew how to look for it, was not the fear of being refused, but the fear of being answered, the fear of what it would mean to have said this aloud and had it received. She said, "I need to think." He nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had expected nothing less and was not going to make the thinking harder by loading it with his own weight. She went to do her laundry work, she thought. The thinking took the shape of her hands in the washwater and the rhythm of the work and the particular quality of her own interior, which had been arranged for a long time around the absence of anyone who would say the thing he had just said. She was not sentimental about it. Would you treat them with kindness? She was 19 years old, and she had learned to be exact about her own feelings rather than decorative, because sentiment without accuracy was a thing that got women in worse trouble than the situation they were trying to feel their way through. What she felt was this. She had gone up that mountain for Holt Greer, and she had found, somewhere between the 4th day's climb and the 3 nights of firelight, would you treat them with kindness? That what she had gone up for and what she was coming back with were not the same thing, and that the difference between them was the thing she had not had a name for until he named it by the window in the storeroom. She went back to the storeroom in the late afternoon. He was sitting where she had left him, which was either patience or stubbornness, and in his case, was likely both wearing the same coat. She sat down across the table from him and said, "Yes." Something in his face that had been held in careful containment released, quietly, with the controlled slowness of something that has been under pressure for a long time and is being allowed to equalize. He reached across the table. His hand, large enough to cover both of hers, settled over them, with the gentleness of a man who had learned to be conscious of his own size in relation to things he did not want to damage. Neither of them said anything else for a while. That was the agreement. What followed the agreement in the days immediately after was not the simple resolution they might have imagined, if they had been imagining. Iron Creek had its own response to the news, which filtered through the settlement with the speed that significant news always travels in a place with nothing competing for attention. And the response was not uniform and was not, in several notable quarters, congratulatory. Would you treat them with kindness? Virginia Pryce held a small gathering of like-minded women the afternoon after the news reached her, in the parlor of her house with its good furniture and its window that faced the main street. And she said nothing directly, which was her method, but what she said indirectly amounted to a comprehensive argument for why this particular arrangement was irregular, improper, and a confirmation of what certain people had suspected all along about the morals and judgment of Nora Fitch. The argument circulated. Arguments in small settlements always did. Del Barker contributed his own flavor, which was cruder and louder and less deniable, standing outside Cobb's on a Thursday afternoon and making a remark to no one in particular about whether Holt Greer had been lonely enough on that mountain to settle for what was available. Nora heard about this the next morning. She heard it from Cobb, who told her in the flat tone of a man passing along information he finds personally offensive but considers it her right to know. She received it the way she received most things that Del Barker put into the world, by filing it in the correct categories. Filing in the correct category and continuing with what she had been doing. What she had been doing was building the life that the agreement required building. Would you treat them with kindness? She had moved her things to Holt's storeroom, which was Cobb's solution to the practical problem of an unmarried woman spending significant portions of every day in a man's room behind his general store. A solution Cobb proposed with the diplomatic delicacy of a man who is trying to do right by several competing obligations simultaneously. She had not yet told him she found the solution somewhat absurd, since, She was already spending most of her time there, and the symbolic difference between having her trunk in the room and not having her trunk in the room seemed, in the arithmetic of actual living, negligible. Would you treat them with kindness? But she accepted it because Cobb was doing his best, and because she had learned that people doing their best deserved to have their efforts received as efforts. The real difficulty of those weeks was not Virginia Pryce's parlor conversations, or Del Barker's contributions to the public discourse. Would you treat them with kindness? The real difficulty Holt was more specifically, Holt in the process of deciding what kind of man he was going to be in the next portion of his life. A decision that was not as straightforward as it appeared from the outside. She saw it in him on an evening in late April, sitting across from him in the storeroom. After the settlement had gone quiet for the night, the candle burning between them, the window showing nothing but dark. Would you treat them with kindness? He was looking at the miniature portrait of Anne, which had been moved from the table to the shelf by the window at some point, a move she had not made, and that she understood he had made deliberately, a repositioning that meant something she was not going to interpret for him. He said, "I don't know how to do this." She waited for the rest. "I know how to live on a mountain. I know how to trap and hunt and read the weather and fix a fence line in January. I know how to be alone." He set down the cup he was holding. "I don't know how to be this. Whatever this is. Whatever I'm asking you to be with me." This was the most honest thing he had said to her, she thought, which was remarkable, given that he was generally a man of considerable honesty. She thought about how to answer it, and decided that the answer it deserved was the same quality of honesty he had used to ask it. "Neither do I," she said. "I don't know how to be chosen. I don't know what to do when someone looks at me and doesn't look away. I've been practicing being invisible for 4 years, and it turns out that's not actually a skill that transfers." He looked at her with that expression she had been cataloging. She continued, "But I know how to do hard things. I know how to keep going when the terrain is bad, and the supplies are low, and the next part is uncertain. I learned that on the mountain. Or maybe I already knew it, and the mountain just showed me what it looked like when the stakes were real." She met High's eyes across the candle. "I think we probably know enough to start. The rest of it we can learn as it comes." He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached across the small table and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, a gesture so quiet and so careful that she felt it in a place that did not have a name. He said, "You are the most practical person I have ever met." She said, "You say that like it's a compliment." And the corner of his mouth moved, the genuine version, and she filed it in the place. She kept the things that mattered, and felt something in her chest that was warm and structural, and did not require examination. The following week was when Virginia Pryce escalated. The escalation did not announce itself as an escalation. It arrived in the form of a conversation, or rather the consequence of a conversation, the conversation having occurred between Virginia and her husband the banker, who was a man of moderate intelligence and significant financial caution, and who understood that his wife's social calculations, whatever their other qualities, were generally reliable as instruments of local order. Nora came back to the boarding house on a Monday afternoon to find a letter had been slid under her door. She still kept the room, had kept paying for it through the weeks of the storeroom arrangement as a reserve against uncertainty, and she stood in the doorway of the small room and read the letter from the boarding house proprietor, a Mrs. Galton, a woman Nora had thought of as neutral, informing her that her rental arrangement would not be renewed at the end of the current month. No explanation, no apology. Just the fact of it and the date. Nora read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and went back to the storeroom. She did not tell Holt immediately. She set the letter in the interior accounting alongside the other entries, and thought about what it meant and what was behind it and where it was likely to go next. Because this was not, she understood, a single event. This was an opening move. She had been right. By Thursday, 3 of the households that had regularly hired her for laundry work sent word, by various indirect means, that they would not be requiring her services for the foreseeable future. Mrs. Alderman through a neighbor. The Tanner family through their eldest. a serious young man who delivered the news with the discomfort of someone who had been given a task he found distasteful but had not known how to refuse. The Holloways simply did not answer the door when she knocked, which was its own kind of answer. She stood on the Holloway porch for a moment, after the door failed to open, looking at the street at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of Iron Creek in late April going about its business. The mud drying in the ruts, the smell of wood smoke and thawing earth. Would you treat them with kindness? And she thought about Virginia Pryce in her parlor, with her silk dress and her good furniture and the particular instrument she was playing, which was the instrument of economic pressure, the oldest and least complicated of the tools available to people in positions of established authority. She was being made impossible to sustain. On Saturday, Reverend Ezra Mull knocked on the storeroom door. Nora opened it. Would you treat them with kindness? The Reverend was a man of 60 with the build of someone who had once been vigorous and had let the vigor go in favor of a kind of deliberate stillness, a physical humility that was either genuine or the performance of it. She had never fully determined which. He wore his black frock coat and white collar and carried his hat in his hands. Making a social call he had been persuaded to make and was not entirely comfortable with. He asked if he might have a word. She let him in. Holt was there and showed no intention of leaving, and the Reverend looked at him, and then looked at Nora, and then looked at a point between them that was easier to address than either of their faces. He said the things Virginia Pryce had sent him to say, wrapped in the language of pastoral concern, the language of the congregation's welfare, and the good of the community, and the importance of propriety in arrangements that bore upon the morals of the settlement. He said them with the apologetic quality of a man who is delivering a message he did not write, and is trying to soften the edges without changing the substance. Nora listened to all of it. Then she said, in the level tone she used for things that mattered, Reverend Mull, I climbed a mountain alone in the worst winter this territory has seen in 30 years. Would you treat them with kindness? I kept a man alive for 3 days while he was dying of fever and infection and a bare wound that would have finished most people in the first week. I did this because he had once treated me as a human being at a moment when no one else in this settlement did, and I considered that worth repaying. She paused. I want to ask you a genuine question. Is that a sin? Or is that what you preach to this congregation to do every Sunday? The Reverend looked at the floor. Because if it's a sin, Nora continued, I'd like to understand the theology of that. And if it's not, I'd like to understand what exactly you've come here to tell me I should be ashamed of. Reverend Mull was quiet for a period that had genuine weight to it. Then he looked up and met her eyes, and what was in his face was not what had been in it when he arrived. There was something else there, something that might have been, in a man more accustomed to it, admiration. He said, You make a fair point, Miss Fitch. He put his hat back on and left. Holt had sat through this exchange without speaking. She could feel him in the room the way you could always feel Holt in any room, the gravitational fact of him. When the Reverend's footsteps had receded across the back lot, Holt said, You didn't need me to say anything. No, I was going to. I know. She looked at him. But it mattered that I said it, not you. He understood this. Would you treat them with kindness? She saw him understand it, the particular kind of understanding that cost something, that required a man to set down the instinct to defend and recognize that being defended was not always what was needed, that sometimes what was needed was to see a person defend themselves. He nodded, the full, deliberate nod. The letter from the boarding house sat in her pocket through all of this. She had not yet told Holt. Would you treat them with kindness? She had been assembling the full picture first. The laundry work gone, the room going, the social architecture Virginia Pryce was building around her, because she wanted to bring him not a problem, but a problem with its dimensions clearly marked. Would you treat them with kindness? And she had learned on the mountain that knowing the dimensions of something was most of what you needed to address it. She told him that evening. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not react the way she had half expected a man might react, with the reflexive move toward action, the instinct to meet the threat on its own ground. He sat with it, the way he sat with most things she told him, with the patience of a man who had learned that listening completely was a more powerful tool than responding quickly. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, how long? End of the month for the room. The laundry work is already gone. He looked at his hands on the table, the large hands. The ones that had gripped the pine trunk in the clearing while the fiver tried to take him, while she held the line against it. He turned them over, looked at the palms, looked at whatever it is a man looks at when he is looking at the history of his own hands. He said, "Then we don't wait." She looked at him. Reverend Mull was just here. He met her eyes. The church is 20 yards from this building. The corner of her mouth moved, only the corner. The Reverend just left. He hasn't gotten far. She thought about Virginia Pryce in her parlor, constructing the architecture of impossibility. She thought about the letter in her pocket and the 3 households and the particular way that small places used economic pressure as a moral instrument. She thought about what it meant that a man 22 years off a mountain was sitting across a small table from her and suggesting they not wait. She said, "You're certain," he said, "Nora. I've been certain since the second day on the mountain, when you sat in the dark with a knife in your hand so a bear couldn't get at me." The words came out with the flat precision she had learned to understand as the register he used for the things he was most serious about. "I was just waiting to know you were certain too." She sat with this. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about the inside of herself, the long-practiced discipline of a woman who had learned to audit her own feelings, precisely because imprecision about feelings in her situation produced worse outcomes than imprecision about anything else. She went through the audit carefully and found what she found, which was the same thing she had found every time she had done this in the past weeks. She said, "I'm certain." He stood up from the chair. The room rearranged itself around him the way rooms always did. He reached for his felt hat on the hook by the door and put it on and held out his hand, the large rough hand, palm up, and waited. She took it. Would you treat them with kindness? They went out the back of the general store into the late afternoon light of Iron Creek in April, the mud drying, the smoke rising, the ordinary business of a small settlement going on around them. And they walked across the back lot toward the church, and Holt treat them with kindness was large enough to contain it entirely, which was not something she had ever experienced before, being contained in that particular way, and she found that it did not feel like being diminished. It felt like being held. Reverend Mull had not in fact gone far. Would you treat them with kindness? He was standing in the churchyard looking at his boots when they came around the corner of the church, and he looked up and saw them, the large man with the careful walk of someone whose leg was still making its argument, and the woman beside him, at the end of his hand. Would you treat them with kindness? And something moved through the Reverend's face that settled into the expression of a man who has just been given a resolution he did not know he was looking for. Holt said, "Reverend, we'd like to do this now if you're willing." Reverend Mull looked at them both. He looked at their joined hands. He looked at the April afternoon around them, the light going gold, the mountains to the west still white in the high elevations, the settlement quiet in the middle of its Tuesday. He said, "Come inside." They went inside. The church was empty at that hour, the benches bare, the afternoon light coming through the plain windows at the angle that made the wood of the walls glow a warm amber, the color of late seasons and long patience. It smelled of beeswax and old timber, and the particular quality of rooms that have held people's most sincere moments for long enough to have retained something of those moments in their walls. Walter Cobb was there. He had followed them. She did not know how he had known to follow, but he was there, standing at the back of the church, with his canvas apron still on and his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has waited a while for something to go right and is relieved to be witnessing it. Reverend Mull opened his book. The ceremony was not long. It did not need to be long. It needed to be true, and it was true, each word of it. And she stood in the amber light of the April church, and made the promises in her clear, honest voice, and heard Holt make his in the low, unhurried register that she had learned carried his most serious meanings. And Cobb stood at the back and witnessed all of it with the expression of a man attending a ceremony he considers personally important, which it was. When it was done, She stood in the church in her wool dress and her leather boots, and he stood beside her in his canvas coat and felt hat and flannel shirt. The two of them in the amber light. Would you treat them with kindness? And she thought about Virginia Pryce in her silk parlor, and the letter in her pocket, and the 3 households and the mountain, and the 3 nights and the fire, and everything that had moved between them on the way down from 8,000 feet. She thought, this is what it looks like when something is real. The Reverend signed the book. Walter Cobb witnessed. They walked back out into the April afternoon of Iron Creek, and the light was still there, going gold toward amber the way it did at this hour, and the mountains were still enormous to the west, and somewhere up there at 8,000 feet in a clearing by an old pine, the ash of her fire ring was still readable in the spring snow. She had left that fire behind. She had not left what it had made. Iron Creek went about its Tuesday. Would you treat them with kindness? Unknowing for now, the way places always go about their business in the hours before the thing that will change them has yet to travel the distance between the place where it happened and the place where everyone will eventually hear about it. Virginia Pryce was in her parlor, but the book had been signed, and in small places with long memories, a signed book in a reverend's hand outweighs a conversation in a parlor every time, however silk the dress, however careful the architecture of the woman who built the conversation. This was the day, and the day was done, and what it had them with kindness, and what it had made of them was permanent in the way that only certain days are permanent, the days that do not merely mark the calendar but divide it into the time before and the time after, the days you carry in the body, long after the mind has moved on to other concerns. The mountains held the last of the light on their peaks as they walked back, and the light held as long as it could. And then the dark came down from the high places, the way it always did, honest and unhurried, and Iron Creek went quiet under it, and what had been made that afternoon, in the amber light of a plain church in an April Tuesday, was not going to be unmade by any parlor conversation, in any silk dress, in any banker's house, on any street, in any small settlement that had ever confused its own authority with something larger than itself. It was done. They were done. And what came next was the rest of it. The news traveled the way news travels in Iron Creek, not in a straight line, in a widening circle, the way a stone dropped in. Still water sends rings outward until they reach every edge of the thing they have disturbed. By the following morning, which was a Wednesday, the fact of the marriage had reached the boarding house, the blacksmith. Would you treat them with kindness? The church pews as in the form of Renmal's own confirmation to the 3 people who came to him directly to ask whether it was true, and the bank. Would you treat them with kindness? Where it arrived on the desk of Virginia Pryce's husband in the form of a note from the Reverend containing the relevant legal particulars. Virginia Pryce heard it over breakfast. She heard it from her husband. She heard it from her husband, who told her with the careful, neutral tone of a man delivering information to a woman he has learned not to deliver information to carelessly, and you treat them with kindness. And she received it with a stillness that was more alarming than any response would have been. The stillness of a woman who has played a game and discovered that the board has been rearranged while she was looking at her own pieces. She said nothing at breakfast. She finished her coffee. She set down the cup, and then she went to the parlor and sat for a long time looking at the window that faced the main street of Iron Creek. What she was looking at, if you could have read the interior of it, was not the street. Would you treat them with kindness? It was the structure she had built, the letter to the boarding house, the conversations with the laundry households, the instructions to her husband about the rental arrangement, the architecture of impossibility she had spent 3 weeks designing, with the precision of a woman who understood that sustained social pressure, applied at the correct load-bearing points, will eventually cause any structure to collapse. She had been correct about the mechanics. She had miscalculated the timeline. Would you treat them with kindness? And now the timeline had moved past the point where the mechanics could do what she had designed them to do, because the thing she had been trying to prevent had been signed in the Reverend's book on a Tuesday afternoon, while she was in her parlor waiting for the pressure to accumulate. This was particular with kindness. This was the particular kind of defeat that Virginia Pryce had never experienced before, because Virginia Pryce had never before encountered the combination of a woman who moved without asking permission and a man who decided without requiring consensus. She sat in her parlor for an hour. Then she stood up and went to find Del Barker. Del Barker was outside Cobb's General Store, because Del Barker was almost always outside Cobb's General Store in the mornings, positioned like a feature of the landscape, that the landscape had not exactly chosen, but had come to accommodate. He was wearing his canvas trousers and his flannel shirt and his battered felt hat, and the expression of a man surveying his domain, which was approximately 15 feet of wooden sidewalk and whatever conversation it produced. Virginia Pryce stopped in front of him. She did not She did not normally stop in front of Del Barker on public streets, because Virginia Pryce did not normally make her instrument visible in the daylight. But the Tuesday in the church had changed the available options, she said, in a voice low enough not to carry to the several people who were also in the vicinity of Cobb's store that morning exactly what she needed Del to say, and where she needed him to say it, and to whom. Del listened. He nodded. He had the expression of a man who has been waiting for an assignment and is glad to finally have one. Nora was crossing the main street at the far end when Del Barker said it. He said it loudly enough to reach her, and loudly enough to reach the 4 other people within range, which was the precise volume Virginia Pryce had specified. He said that whatever paper the Reverend had signed, Iron Creek knew what a woman who spent 3 months alone on a mountain with a man was, and that a signature didn't change the nature of the thing, only the name you put on it. Nora stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the main street of Iron Creek on a Wednesday morning in late April, with the mud drying in the ruts under her boots and the sun doing its serious April work overhead, and Del Barker's voice still hanging in the air around her. And she did the audit she always did in the first seconds after something like this, the rapid internal accounting of what the situation was, and what it required, and what she was going to do. The audit took 3 seconds. Then she walked straight toward Del Barker. He did not expect this. People did not generally walk toward Del Barker when he said things. They walked away, or they looked at the ground, or they pretended they had not heard. Would you treat them with kindness? The walking toward was not in the playbook he had been operating from for the past 15 years, and his face registered this with the genuine surprise of a man discovering that the game has changed rules in the middle of a move. She stopped at a distance that required him to look at her, without any comfortable intermediate space to look at. Instead, and she said, in the level-carrying voice she had found on the mountain and had not put down since, Del Barker, I want you to say that again. He blinked. Say what again? What you just said. Say it again. To my face. With these 4 people watching. He opened his mouth. And then something happened to Del Barker. That did not often happen to Del Barker, which was that the words did not come. The words that had come so easily a moment ago, when her back was turned and the distance was sufficient for what he did to work, those words you treat them with kindness. Those words had apparently required the particular conditions of the back turned and the distance, and face to face in the direct light of a Wednesday morning, with Nora Fitch standing 4 feet away looking at him with eyes that had no give in them. The words found they had somewhere else to be. He said nothing. Nora looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned to the 4 people who had witnessed the original statement and were now witnessing its aftermath with the wide-awake attention of people watching something that has departed from the expected script. She said, I climbed that mountain to save a man who was dying, because no one else in this settlement was going to do it. I kept him alive for 3 days. We came down together, and we were married by Reverend Mull yesterday afternoon, legally and in the sight of God, and Walter Cobb witnessed it. She paused. Anyone in Iron Creek who wants to have a conversation about my character is welcome to compare it to the character of a town that decided a man's life was not worth an afternoon's effort, and then found things to say about the woman who decided differently. She walked on. Behind her, Del Barker stood on the wooden sidewalk with his mouth doing something that was not quite speaking. Would you treat them with kindness? And the 4 witnesses stood with the expressions of people who have just had a comfortable assumption removed and are deciding how they feel about the space it has left. Virginia Pryce, watching from the window of the bank, saw the whole thing. She watched Nora walk away down the street. She watched the 4 witnesses and what their faces were doing. She watched Del Barker standing useless in front of the store. Would treat them with kindness, in the way that intelligent people understand things they would prefer not to understand. That she had the wrong instrument, that she had sent an instrument and that the wrong instrument had produced the wrong result, and that the result was not going to be undone by sending the instrument again. She let the curtain fall. Holt was at the window of the storeroom when Nora came back. He had been watching. He had seen it from the window, or most of it, the angle not perfect but enough. He was standing when she came through the door, his hand on the window frame, the leg still not at the point where standing for long was without cost, but he was standing. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "I handled it." He said, "I saw." A beat of silence. Then the corner of his mouth. The genuine version, the one she had filed. You walked toward him. He needed someone to walk toward him. He shook his head. Not disagreement. The other kind of headshake. The kind that is the physical expression of something for which the language is slightly insufficient. He said, low and deliberate, the register he reserved for the things he was most serious about. "You are the most complete person I have ever known." She set down what she was carrying and looked at him at the window, the April light behind him, the mountain visible over his shoulder through the glass. She said, "You didn't try to come out." "No. That was the right call," he said. "I know. And would you treat them with kindness?" And then, because it needed saying, because there are certain things that require the actual words, and not just the understanding between people who have learned to read each other's silences, because it was yours to do, not mine. She crossed the small room and stood beside him at the window. Not in front of him. Beside him. Would you treat them with kindness? The same street, the same April afternoon. The same Iron Creek going about its business in the aftermath of something that had just shifted slightly on its axis. The days that followed were the days of adjustment, the slow organic process, by which a settlement that has formed one opinion begins the work of revising it, which is never fast and never complete but is real and is visible to those who know how to read the signs. Harriet Bowman, who kept the boarding house and was 70 years old and had therefore outlived the opinions of enough powerful women to have developed her own perspective on the matter, came to find Nora on a Thursday. She came to the storeroom and knocked, and when Nora opened the door, she looked at Nora with the direct eyes of a woman who has been watching things for a long time, and said, "I heard what you said to Del Barker in the street." She paused. "Good." Then she held out a covered pot that contained the best beef stew in Iron Creek, which Nora knew from the smell, and said it was a wedding gift, and left. Nora stood in the doorway holding the pot and felt something in her chest that was warm and wide and did not require categorizing. Walter Cobb, who had been negotiating the delicate position of a man who liked both parties in what had become a local conflict and had, therefore, been careful to take no position that could be reported to either side, finally stopped being careful. He told 3 separate customers on a Friday that Holt Greer was a man he had known for 20 years, and that Nora Fitch was a woman he had observed closely for 2, and that as far as he was concerned, Iron Creek had been given something it did not deserve in either of them, and ought to act accordingly. He said this in the flat, matter-of-fact voice he used for factual statements, which in Cobb carried more weight than other men's emphatics. By the second week of May, the shape of the settlement's opinion had shifted enough to be visible in small ways. 2 of the 3 laundry households sent word that they would be resuming the arrangement. Not 3. 2. But 2 was more than 0, and the direction of it was clear. Del Barker left Iron Creek on a Tuesday in the first week of May. He left quietly, with his horse and his saddlebags and his felt hat, and he did not say where he was going, and nobody asked, which was its own kind of answer about where the town's sympathies had landed. Virginia Pryce did not leave Iron Creek. She was not the kind of woman who left. She was the kind of woman who remained and adjusted, who recalibrated her instruments and found new equilibria, and went on being powerful. In the particular way, she had always been powerful, through position and money and the long institutional memory of a small settlement. But something had changed in the texture of the power. Some load-bearing element of it had shifted, and she knew it, and Iron Creek knew it, even if no one said it directly. She still attended church on Sundays. She still wore the silk dress and the gloves and the careful hat. But when she walked past Nora and Holt on the street, which happened for the first time on a Sunday in mid-May, would you treat them with kindness? She looked straight ahead with the focused attention of a woman who has decided that the most dignified response to a situation she cannot alter is to decline to acknowledge it. Nora watched her pass. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about the letter in the pocket and the 3 households and the boarding house arrangement that had not been renewed, all the small instruments of a large campaign. She felt something with kindness, and she felt something that was not triumph and was not satisfaction, but was closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you have been carrying for so long you had forgotten. The weight was something added rather than something original to you. The last Sunday of May, Reverend Mull preached a sermon about the particular kind of courage required to do the right thing when the right thing is inconvenient. He did not name anyone. He did not need to name anyone. The congregation kindness. That morning included Nora and Holt sitting together in the middle of the church rather than the last row, and it included Virginia Pryce in the front, and it included Harriet Bowman and Walter Cobb and the rest of the settlement. Would you treat them with kindness? And every person in that church who had been in Iron Creek for the past several months heard the sermon and understood what it was about and reached their own conclusions. The Sunday after that, a woman named Clara Tate, who had not spoken to Nora in 2 years, and whose avoidance had been so consistent that it had the quality of a practiced skill, stopped her after the service and said that she had heard about what happened on the mountain. She said it with the directness of someone who has been thinking about saying something for a while and has finally run out of reasons not to. She said, "I wouldn't have done it." Nora looked at her. Clara Tate said, "I want you to know that I understand that." Nora said, "Most people wouldn't have." That's not a condemnation. It was a hard thing. Clara Tate nodded and went on her way, and Nora went on hers, and that was the whole of it. But it mattered in the way that small honest moments matter more than large insincere ones. The leg healed through May into June, not linearly, not on a schedule that satisfied Holt's impatience or Nora's precision, but steadily in the way of bodies that have decided to do a thing and are doing it at their own pace. He moved, without the brace, by the 2nd week of May, slowly and with the slight favoring that would remain, she suspected, for the rest of his life. Not a limp exactly, but a quality of movement on the left side that was different from the right. A reminder written into the way he walked of what the mountain had done and what the winter had been. He went back to the mountain in June, not permanently. He went back to open the cabin for the season, to check what the winter had taken and what it had left, and to bring down what could be used and repair what could be repaired. He went for a week and came back looking like himself in a way he had not quite looked like himself in the town. The color and the depth of him that belonged to elevation and open air returned to his face. He came back with the papers. He set them on the table in the storeroom, which they had continued to use past the point of necessity, because it had become theirs in the way that certain spaces become yours, not because of legal arrangement, but because of what happened in them. He set the papers down and pushed them across to Nora. She picked them up. Read them. The land deed. 400 acres in the Iron Creek Range, held in the name of Holt Greer since 1801. And beside it, a second document, newer, the ink still with a slight freshness to it, the date 3 weeks prior, filed with the Territory Land Office in the nearest town of sufficient size to have one. The second document transferred equal ownership of the 400 acres to Nora Greer, née Fitch. She set the papers down. She looked at him. He said, "There's something else. On the eastern section, above the second creek, I found a silver vein in 1815. I didn't do anything about it because I didn't need anything about it." He paused. "You should know it's there." She thought about this, about what 400 acres meant and what a silver vein meant and what together they meant for a woman who had been a laundress in a rented room behind a boarding house for 2 years. She thought about Virginia Pryce's husband's bank and the letter about the rental arrangement and the 3 households and the precise architecture of economic impossibility that had been built around her. She said, "Why didn't you file this before?" "Because before, I didn't have anyone to file it for. The words came out with the plainness of something he had thought through carefully and decided not to dress. I had no use for what 400 acres means in legal terms when the only person it affected was me. Now it affects you, and I need what affects you to be correct. She looked at the papers again, at her name on the second document, at the ink, at the fact of it. She said, "Holt." He waited. She said, "You understand that this makes me more secure than Virginia Pryce." The corner of his mouth. The real version. "I do. She's going to find that out. Eventually. She's not going to enjoy it," he said, with the dry deliberateness that was his version of humor. "No, she is not." Nora set the papers down on the table and folded her hands over them and thought about the shape of things. About where she had been a year ago and where she was now, and about the distance between those 2 points, which could be measured in miles and in altitude, and in nights of firelight and in 3 months in a storeroom and in a Tuesday afternoon in an amber church, and in the document currently under her hands with her name on it next to his. She thought about her father's farm going wrong in pieces, about her mother's last winter, about the rented room and the laundry work, and the way Iron Creek had arranged itself around her absence from its social calendar, as though her absence were the natural condition and her presence the imposition. And she thought about a man sitting at the edge of a well in August looking at the middle distance, giving her the courtesy of not being examined while she collected herself, and saying the only true thing that anyone had said to her in years. She thought, this is what it looks like when the long arithmetic finally balances. The summer came to Iron Creek, the way summers came, with the meadows going green and the wildflowers appearing in the high country, the Indian paintbrush and the bluebells and the wild columbine that Holt described with the specific vocabulary of a man who had watched them come back every year for 2 decades and knew each one by character as much as by name. Would you treat them with kindness? He described them to her in the evenings, and she listened the way she listened to things that mattered, with the attention that means you are storing the thing rather than simply hearing it. In July, they went up to the cabin together for the first time. The trail was different in summer, green and open rather than white and closed, the same terrain wearing a completely different aspect. She recognized the places she had passed on the way up in April, the rock shelter, the stand of aspens where she had left the mare, the clearing with the great old pine which she saw now in summer light rather than the gray of the fever days. And it was both the same and entirely different, the place itself unchanged, but her experience of it, so altered that it felt like looking at a familiar face in better light and finally seeing it whole. The cabin was small and honest in the way that things built for function rather than appearance are honest. Holt moved through it with the ease of a man returning to his own body after a long time in borrowed space, touching things with a casualness that was the casualness of ownership in the deepest sense, not legal but constitutional, the relationship between a person and the place that has been the container of their life. She moved through it more carefully. She was not claiming it so much as learning it, which was a different kind of movement. She set her things in the corners they belonged in. She hung her wool shawl on the hook by the door. She arranged the small items she had brought, practical things, a better pot than what Holt had, thread and needles, the 2 books from her room, her mother's small collection of dried herbs in their paper packets. Would you treat them with kindness? She picked up the miniature portrait of Anne from the shelf where Holt had replaced it, carefully, with the respect you give things that belong to the dead and to the living simultaneously, and she set it in the place where the morning light would touch it first. Holt watched her do this from the doorway. He said nothing. Would you treat them with kindness? But she felt him watching and understood that it mattered to him in a way that did not require articulation, the way certain things that are done correctly announce their correctness in the quality of the silence they produce. The summer passed in the high country, with the particular richness of a season that is compressed by altitude and therefore more vivid for being short. She learned the trails Holt knew. He learned what she knew about the medical uses of what grew in the high meadows, information he received with the seriousness of a man who has survived the winter on his own judgment and understands the value of expanding the knowledge base. They worked the land together, not farming, not exactly, but living in a way that required the land's cooperation, and offered it respect in return, the oldest compact between people and places. In the evenings he read to her sometimes, the slow, deliberate reading of a man for whom words are specific, and she read to him sometimes, and sometimes they sat on either side of the cabin's single window in the long mountain dusk, and did not read, and did not talk, but occupied the silence together in the way that two people can only do when the silence between them has become a shared thing rather than a gap. September came, and with it the first cold, the first warning, from the high peaks that the mountain had a winter coming, and intended to have it. They made the preparations that the season required, laying in supplies, bringing in wood, winterizing the cabin in the systematic way that Holt had done alone for 20 years, and now did with 2 pairs of hands, which was more than twice as fast and more than twice as satisfying, which he did not say but which she observed in the way he moved through the work. On an evening in the middle of September, with the first real frost on the ground, and the peaks above them already showing fresh snow, they sat by the cabin's stove with the fire well banked, and the lamp lit and the mountain dark and still outside the window. Nora said, "I need to tell you something." He set down the piece of harness he had been mending. He looked at her with the full attention. The particular quality of listening she had come to understand was his most complete form of presence, she told him. He was very still. Would you treat them with kindness? He was still in the way that he was still when something large was moving through him and he was not yet sure what form it was going to take when it arrived at the surface. She watched him and waited, and did not fill the stillness with anything, because the stillness belonged to him, and what was happening in it was his to have. Then his hand moved, the large, rough hand. It came across the space between them, and settled over her hands, where they rested, in her lap, and it was careful in the way it was always careful, the size of it conscious of itself, covering her hands entirely, warm and present and real. His eyes, when sheathed kindness, his eyes, she looked at them, were bright in the lamplight with something that had no name she would try to put on it, something that lived past the reach of the words she had at her disposal. Would you treat them with kindness? And she understood that she was seeing the inside of a man who had believed for 22 years that he had used up his portion of the things that matter, and was now discovering that the portion was not used up, that there was more, that the mountain had kept it for him, until someone came up to find it. He did not try to speak. He knew and she knew that what the moment contained was larger than what words could carry without losing something in the translation. She turned her hands over under his and held on. Outside the cabin, the mountain was dark and enormous and indifferent in the way it had always been indifferent, the way it would always be, the peaks carrying their first snow into the clear autumn dark, the pines holding still, the creek somewhere below them moving in the frost. But inside the single window of the cabin was lamplight. And in that lamplight, would you treat them with kindness? 2 people who had each arranged their lives around the certainty of their own insufficiency had arrived, by separate difficult routes, at the same place, which was here, which was this. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was the discovery that the arrangement had been wrong, and the evidence of its wrongness was sitting in the warm circle of what they had made together. The winter would come. The mountain would see to that. Iron Creek would go on being Iron Creek, with Virginia Pryce in her silk parlor, and Harriet Bowman with her beef stew, and Walter Cobb in his canvas apron, and Reverend Mull with his sermons, and the ordinary human chicanery of a settlement making itself up as it went, getting things wrong and occasionally right, the way settlements did. Would you treat them with kindness? And in the spring, when the passes opened and the trails were clear and the high meadows were starting their annual argument with winter about who had jurisdiction over the flowers, would you treat them with kindness? The traders and trappers who came through the Iron Creek Range would begin to tell a story they had heard from each other, about a cabin at 8,000 feet, about a man and a woman whose voices, when the wind was still, could be heard from the trail below, the low one and the clear one. Would you treat them with kindness? Talking or laughing or simply existing in the mountain air in the way of people who have found something they were not looking for and have had the sense to hold on to it. The old-timers in Iron Creek, the ones who had been there from the beginning and had watched the whole of it play out from beginning to this. would hear that story and nod without surprise. They knew what it was. It was the sound of two people who had each been told, by the world or by themselves, that they were not worth the trouble. Discovering they were wrong, and not for a single morning of the life they had built in that high country, letting themselves forget it. Would you treat them with kindness? The winter of 1822 to 1823 was nothing like the winter before it. This was not a coincidence, and it was not meteorology. It was the difference between a winter you face alone and a winter you face with someone, which are not two versions of the same experience but two entirely different experiences that happen to share a season. Would you treat them with kindness? The cabin held the cold out adequately, which was the most honest thing you could say about a structure built for function in a climate that did not negotiate. Holt had built it himself 22 years ago from the timber he had felled on the eastern slope, and he had built it for one person's occupation, which meant that two people in it created a warmth that the logs themselves had not been designed to contain. This was not unpleasant. It was, in fact, the opposite of unpleasant, though neither of them was the kind of person who would use the word cozy without some internal resistance. Nora learned the cabin's winter logic the way she learned most things, by observing it systematically and then modifying her approach based on what the observation produced. She learned which wall let in the most cold, at which hour, and what positioning of the second blanket addressed it. She learned the rhythm of the stove, which needed treat them with kindness, which you wanted feeding at particular intervals if you wanted the temperature in the far corner, where she had arranged her things to stay above a certain threshold. Would you treat them with kindness? She learned the sounds the cabin made in the deep cold, the contractions of the wood, the particular complaint of the roof beam, when the temperature dropped below a certain point in the night, the way the wind found the southeast corner, and discussed the matter with it at length. Holt watched her learn the cabin and said nothing, which she had come to understand was his form of approval at its most complete. He was healing still. The leg was the truth-teller. On good days it barely announced itself, a slight consideration in the way he distributed his weight when he stood still for long periods, a preference for the right side on uneven terrain. On bad days which came with the cold and with overuse, and with no pattern she could predict well enough to prevent, it reminded him at length, and without apology, that it had been broken and that broken things, even well-mended ones, retained the memory of their breaking in the tissue and the bone. She had learned not to comment on the bad days unless he brought them up. Would you treat them with kindness? She had learned this the way you learn things that require you to override your first instinct, which was to address the problem, because she had identified early that addressing the problem on a bad leg day was received by Holt as a form of surveillance that he had not agreed to and that compounded the day rather than improving it. Would you treat them with kindness? So she let the bad days be bad days, and she adjusted what she was doing in the vicinity of the bad days without announcing that she was adjusting it, and this approach produced better outcomes than the alternative. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything with kindness. He knit everything she did, which she knew because of the quality of his attention, which had always been total, the attention of a man who had spent 20 years in a wilderness, where inattention had direct and immediate consequences, and had never unlearned the habit of looking at things completely. He said, on a bad leg day in the middle of November, when she had quietly taken over the outside wood stacking that he had been planning to do, you do that thing. She was stacking wood. She did not stop stacking. What thing? Where you fix the problem without naming the problem. The wood needed stacking. Nora. She set down the piece she was holding and looked at him in the doorway. He was leaning against the frame with the slight adjustment that was the bad day's particular posture, his arms crossed over the large chest, the felt hat on, his breath making clouds in the November air. She said, "Do you want me to stop?" He said, "No." A pause. "I want you to know that I see it." She picked up the wood. "I know you see it. And?" She thought about what came after "and." She thought about the particular texture of being seen by someone who is paying that quality of attention, which was not the same texture as being watched, which she had spent 19 years experiencing in its less welcome forms. Being seen by Holt was different. It was more like being read by someone who had taken the time to learn the language. She said, "And I'm glad." He was quiet for a moment. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Then he came off the doorframe and came to where she was and took the next piece of wood from the pile and stacked it himself, and they stacked the rest of the winter wood together in the November cold without speaking, which was not silence in the sense of absence, but silence in the sense of fullness, a silence that had run out of anything to prove. The winter passed. Not quickly. Not in the way that happy times are sometimes said to pass, as though happiness were a gas that burned faster than the ordinary fuel of days. Would you treat them with kindness? It passed at the pace of a mountain winter, which is the pace of something that does not compromise, that has all the time in the world and none of your urgency, and which produces in the people who live inside it a particular kind of patience. Pryce, that is not the patience of resignation, but of genuine accommodation, the patience of people who have stopped fighting the pace of things and started living inside it. She wrote letters in the winter. This surprised her, the degree to which she wanted to write them. She wrote to Harriet Bowman, who had sent the beef stew, and whose response arrived in March by a trapper who knew the route to the cabin and understood that civilization's postal ambitions extended to 8,000 feet if you were willing to carry them. Harriet's letters were short and factual, and contained more warmth than most people's long ones, and Nora read them to Holt in the evenings. Would you treat them with kindness? And he listened with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered to her, because they mattered to her. She wrote to Walt kindness. She wrote to Walter Cobb, for whom she felt the particular affection reserved for people who did the right thing not because it was easy, but because it was the right thing, and that was sufficient reason. Cobb's letters were longer than Harriet's and contained news of Iron Creek in the specific, unsentimental way of a man reporting facts. And through these letters the settlement's winter took shape in the cabin at 8,000 feet. Virginia Pryce and her parlor and her recalibrations and the ordinary human weather of a place going on being itself. Holt did not write letters. He had not written letters in 22 years and had not suffered from the absence. But he read the ones she received with an attention that told her something about what it meant to him to have a connection to the world below, even an indirect one, even one that arrived by way of a trapper carrying dispatches in his coat pocket. It told her that the 22 years of chosen separation had not been without cost, that even a man who had arranged his life around solitude carried the weight of what solitude cost and called it freedom, because that was the name he had available. February treat them with kindness came with the particular quality of light that February has at high altitude, a brightness that is not warmth but is the suggestion of warmth, the light doing more than the temperature, the snow on the open slopes catching the longer days and returning them with interest. She went out in this light when the weather allowed it, sometimes alone and sometimes with Holt, walking the trails that he had walked alone for so long and that now had her boot prints alongside his, the large and the less large, the record of their passage written in the snow that would be gone by May. She was beginning to show by February. This was not dramatic, not in the way that things are dramatic when they are surprises. She had known since September. Holt had known since September. The knowledge had been between them all winter, with the quality of something precious and also enormous, something that treat them with kindness. The required care in the handling not because it was fragile, but because its weight was real, and they were both people who believed in being accurate about the weight of real things. She felt well. Would you treat them with kindness? She told him this truthfully, and he received it with the combination of relief and continued vigilance that she had come to understand was simply how he processed information about her well-being. Would you treat them with kindness? An endless re-audit that he could not entirely stop performing, and that she had stopped trying to talk him out of, because it came from a place she understood and did not want to argue with. He had lost Anne this way, in a winter at distance, with no warning and no way to change the outcome after the fact. Would you treat them with kindness? She understood without requiring him to explain it that every good morning she reported to him was received against the background of a morning that had not been good, a morning 22 years ago that had arrived with news. He had spent the subsequent decades somewhere between carrying and being carried by. Would you treat them with kindness? minimize by pointing to what was different. She simply reported accurately and let the accuracy do what it could against the weight of the old fact. One morning in March, she was at the cabin window watching the weather change on the upper peaks, the cloud formations that she had been learning to read with increasing confidence. When she heard him come in from outside where he had been checking the wood supply, would you treat them with kindness? And she heard the quality of his movement change in the way it sometimes changed when the leg was making a serious argument. Would you treat them with kindness? And she turned without thinking, and he was standing in the middle of the cabin with his hand on the table, and his face doing the controlled version of what the bad days produced. She crossed the room. Not with the hesitation of someone uncertain of their welcome. With the directness of someone who has established over months of shared space that presence in the difficult moments is not intrusion, but its opposite, is the thing that makes difficult moments survivable. She put her hand on his back, between the shoulder blades, the large shoulders. He was still for a moment, and then something in him released, not dramatically, quietly, the way pressure releases from a thing that has been holding it too long, and has finally been given permission to set it down. He said, "Lo, I keep thinking." She waited about what it would mean if something went wrong. She kept her hand where it was. She said, I know you know." He turned and looked at her, the direct look, and his eyes had in them the old fear, the one he had lived with. So long he had probably stopped being able to distinguish it from himself. The fear that was the shape of what had happened with Anne. "I can't make it go away," she said. "You don't have to make it go away. It's a real thing, Holt. What happened was real. The fear is real. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise." She held his eyes. "I'm just asking you to let me be here alongside the fear. You don't have to carry that alone anymore." He looked at her. He said, "You do that thing again." "What thing?" "Where you fix the problem without making the person feel fixed." The corner of her mouth. She could not help it. "It's not a thing. It's just the truth." He put his arms around her, the large, careful arms, conscious of the weight of them, and she let herself be held in the way she had been learning was possible, since he first put his hand over hers. On that September evening, would you treat them with kindness? Let herself occupy of being held by someone who held you because you were the specific person they wanted to hold, and not because you were the available alternative to no one. March brought the first melt. Not the real melt, not the deep thaw that would come in April and May, and turn the high meadows into a patchwork of white and the first tentative green. But the suggestion of it, the way the icicles on the cabin's south eave began dripping in the afternoons, the way the snow on the open slopes took on a granular quality in the strong midday light, the way the creek below the cabin, which had been silent under its ice lid for months, could be heard again if you stood near it in the warmest part of the day, a low muffled sound like something trying to remember what movement felt like. Holt heard it first, because he heard everything on this mountain first, his ear calibrated to frequencies she was still developing. He was outside one morning in the last week of March, and he stopped and he tilted his head in the direction of the creek, and then he looked at her where she stood in the cabin doorway and he said, "Listen." She listened. She heard it, the low sound of water moving under ice, distant, muffled, alive. He said, not a proclamation, just the word, placed in the air between them, with the precision of a man who has watched 30 winters resolve into 30 springs on this mountain, and who understands what the first sound of the creek moving means, which is that the long-held breath of winter is beginning slowly to release. She thought about the spring below, about Iron Creek in April, which she had barely seen the previous year, having spent April on the mountain. She thought about what they would do when the passes opened and the descent became possible, and the world below came back into reach. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about this not with anxiety, but with a kind of interested attention, the way you think about a chapter that is coming that you have not read yet. She said, "We'll go down in May." He looked at her, confirming. "I want to see Harriet," she said, "and Cobb. I want to walk down the main street of Iron Creek in the daylight and buy what we need from Cobb's store and go to Sunday service if Reverend Mull is preaching, and then come back up here." She met his eyes. "I want to go down as what we are." He understood what she meant. Not hiding, not managing, simply occupying the space they had earned in the place they were from, which was the most ordinary thing in the world and also, for the two of them, the most radical. He said, "All right," she said, "Virginia Pryce will see us, yes. You'll need to not say anything to Virginia Pryce." A long pause. Then, with a dryness that had developed over the winter into something she genuinely cherished, "That seems like an unreasonable constraint." She said, "I know, but I'm asking anyway." He said, "Fine." The corner of his mouth. She filed it. They came down from the mountain in the second week of May, 1823, when the trail was clear and the passes were passable, and the valley below was fully in the green extravagance of a Colorado spring. The descent took 2 days, which was no longer the physical production it had been when Holt's leg was at its worst. Would you treat them with kindness? Though he still moved on the steeper sections with the particular careful attention of a man who has learned to respect the left side's limitations and plan accordingly. Would you treat them with kindness? She rode the mare for the lower sections, not because she was incapable of walking them, but because Holt had asked her to, and she had decided that some requests from a man who asked for very little deserved to be honored without an argument about principle. They came into Iron Creek on a Thursday morning. The settlement was at its May best, which was considerable. The cottonwoods along the creek were in full leaf, the early flowers in the window boxes of the better-kept cabins, the mud of March and April dried to a firm and navigable surface, the air carrying the particular mixed scent of growing things and wood smoke and horse, and the communal breath of a small place going about the business of being alive in a good season. People saw them. People always saw things in Iron Creek. It was the size of the place and the pace of it, the way any arrival registered like a stone in still water. What was different this time was what the seeing looked like. Harriet Bowman came out of the boarding house before they had reached the middle of the main street, came out in her wool dress and her apron with her white hair pinned up and her direct eyes already set on them, and she walked to Nora with the unhurried purpose of a woman who has decided what she is doing and requires no further consultation about it. And she took Nora's hands in her own dry, capable hands and looked at her for a moment and said, "You look well." Nora said, "I am well." Harriet looked at Holt, she said, with the directness of 70 years of not being bothered with indirection. "You look better than dead," Holt said, considerably. Harriet made the sound that was her version of a laugh, which was short and genuine and over quickly, and she told them to come to supper that evening, which was an instruction rather than an invitation, and she went back into the boarding house. Walter Cobb, when they came into the store, leaned on his counter and looked at Holt with the expression of a man who has been waiting to have a particular conversation and is pleased the opportunity has finally arrived. He said, "You look like yourself again." Holt said, "More or less." Cobb looked at Nora. He looked at the evidence of May. He looked back at Holt with the expression updating in real time. He said, "Well." Nora said, "Well," Cobb said, gathering himself in the way of a man who is going to be practical about something. Because being practical is what has to offer. "What do you need?" She gave him the list. He filled it without comment, which was his highest form of welcome, the welcome that treated them as people who simply belonged here, which was exactly what they were. The news of their arrival moved through Iron Creek in the way that news moved. Would you treat them with kindness? By the time they came out of Cobb's store with the supplies, there were more people in the main street than there had been when they arrived, which was not a coincidence, and was not exactly a crowd, but was the quiet accumulation of a settlement that had learned something significant was within viewing distance and had found reasons to be outdoors. Clara Tate was at the end of the street with a basket, not doing anything particular with the basket serving primarily as a reason to be standing at the end of the street. She looked at Nora as they passed and she nodded, the full, deliberate nod, the nod of someone making a clear choice about what position they are taking. Nora nodded back. 2 men from the eastern edge of the settlement, ranchers whose names she knew, stopped their conversation to look at Holt with the frank assessment of men evaluating another man they have heard stories about, and one of them said, "Greer, glad you made it." The words plain and direct and requiring no elaboration. the form of acknowledgement that men of that time and place used for things they considered significant. Holt said, "Thank you," which was also plain and direct and cost him something she could see in the way he said it, because gratitude was still the thing he was least practiced at. But he was practicing. Virginia Pryce was there. Of course she was there. Virginia Pryce was always where things were happening, because Virginia Pryce understood that presence was power in its most basic form. She was at the entrance to her husband's bank, in a day dress of deep green, gloves, her careful hat, the posture that was second nature to her, everything assembled with the precision of a woman who understood that how you occupied space in public was itself a statement. She saw them when they were still 20 yards away. Nora felt Holt beside her feel the same sightline, and she felt him register it, and she felt, without looking at him, his decision not to speak, which was, "You treat them with kindness?" which was the thing she had asked of him, and which she understood was costing him something real, because Holt Greer's silence in the presence of a person who had done what Virginia Pryce had done was not the natural equilibrium. But he held it. They walked toward the bank, because the bank was in the direction they were walking, and there was no reason to alter their route, and every reason not to. They walked at them with kindness. They walked at their ordinary pace, which was not slow and not pointed, simply the pace of people who are going somewhere and are not interested in what the audience thinks of the going. Virginia Pryce stood in the entrance of the bank and watched them come. "Would you treat them with kindness?" And as they reached the point where she was close enough to speak to, where acknowledging each other was unavoidable by the simple geometry of proximity, Virginia Pryce did something that Nora had not predicted, and that told her something she had not known with certainty until that moment. Virginia Pryce looked at Nora, directly, fully, the calculating eyes without their usual comfortable distance. And in those eyes, for one moment that was shorter than most moments, and longer than some, Nora saw it, not remorse. Virginia Pryce was not constructed for remorse in the simple sense, but something that lived in the same territory. Something that looked, from where Nora was standing in the May morning light, like a woman looking at what she had done and finding the accounting unexpectedly complicated. Virginia Pryce said, "Mrs. Greer." 2 words. Her voice was level, completely level. The voice of a woman who had mastered the level voice through long practice. Nora said, "Mrs. Pryce." 2 words back, the same level register, the same complete control. And then they had passed each other, and the moment was behind them, and the main street of Iron Creek was ahead of them in the May morning, and Holt was beside her, and neither of them said anything for a full half block. Then Holt said quietly, "That's all it was going to be." Nora said, "That's enough." And it was. It was enough. Not because Virginia Pryce had been punished in any dramatic sense. Not because the account had been settled in the way that accounts in stories are sometimes settled with a public reversal or a loud defeat. Would you treat them with kindness? But because the woman who had spent 3 weeks building an architecture of impossibility around Nora Fitch had just called her Mrs. Greer on the main street of Iron Creek in front of whoever was watching, and had said it in the voice of a woman who had run out of the alternative, which was not justice in the large operatic sense, but it was truth, and truth, in Nora's experience, was the more durable of the two. Sunday service was the following morning. Would you treat them with kindness? Because she had said she wanted to, and because wanting things and going to get them was a practice she had decided not to abandon. The church was full, which it generally was in good weather, and they sat in the middle of the church, not the back row, not the front, the middle, which was where ordinary people sat, which was what they were. Would you treat them with kindness? Reverend Mull preached about the return of seasons and what seasons meant, which was a sermon with an obvious topography that any person in the church with a functioning sense of where the sermon was pointed could navigate without difficulty. He preached about the things that survive winters, about how some things look finished when they are merely dormant, about how the judgment of November is not the final word on what April will say. He did not look at Nora and Holt specifically. He did not need to. After the service, in the churchyard in the May morning, a thing happened that Nora had not planned for, which was that people came to speak with them. Not everyone. Not in the organized way of a formal welcome. Would you treat them with kindness, but in the accumulating way of individuals who had each made a private decision about what side of a thing they were on, and who had decided that the side they were on was the side that walked over in a churchyard on a Sunday morning and introduced themselves or reintroduced themselves or said what they had not said before? Would you treat them with kindness? Mrs. Galton, who had sent the letter about the boarding house rental, came with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something uncomfortable for some time and has decided that setting it down is better than continuing to carry it. She said, "I owe you an apology, Miss Fitch." Then she corrected herself, Mrs. Greer. She did not explain the apology or elaborate on it, which Nora appreciated, because elaboration would have made it about Mrs. Galton's feelings rather than Nora's experience. Just the apology. Nora accepted it with the same directness, and Mrs. Galton went on her way with the lighter posture of someone who has set the thing down. The rancher with kindness. The rancher from the eastern edge, the one who had spoken to Holt in the street, brought his wife, a woman with a direct handshake and weather-reddened cheeks. Would you treat them with kindness? And they spoke for several minutes about the high country, and about the spring, and about the practical questions of life at 8,000 feet with the approaching seasons. And there was, in this conversation, the ease of people talking about real things they all understood, which was its own form of welcome, the welcome that treats you as competent rather than fragile. Harriet Bowman stood at the edge of the churchyard and watched all of this with the expression of a woman tallying a ledger in her head and finding the results satisfactory. When Nora caught her eye, Harriet gave her the small nod, the full, deliberate nod. Nora gave it back. They stayed in Iron Creek for 3 days. They slept in the room at the boarding house that Harriet had prepared for them, which was her largest room, offered without comment. Would you treat them with kindness? They had supper with Harriet the first evening, and with Cobb and his wife the second, and spent the third evening alone by the boarding house fire, which was the right proportion of company and quiet. On the second day, Nora went alone to the land office with the papers Holt had filed, not because the filing with kindness, not because the filing required a visit, but because she wanted to hold the papers in the office where they were registered and feel the reality of what they represented, which was a different kind of security than anything she had known before. Not the security of having enough or of being protected, but the security of ownership, of standing on ground that was legally and permanently hers. The clerk at the land office was a young man who looked at the papers and at Nora and at the papers again and said, 400 acres, Eastern Ridge, section, Iron Creek Range. You and Mr. Greer, joint title. He stamped the record. That's a significant holding, Mrs. Greer, she said. Yes, he said, with the slightly awed tone of someone doing a calculation. There are mineral notations on the eastern section. She said, yes, he said. If those are verified, she said, thank you for your time. She walked out into the May afternoon. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, with her hands at her sides and the papers tucked in the pocket of her wool coat, and the sun doing its serious work overhead, and Iron Creek going about its Thursday business around her. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about the rented room behind the boarding house and the laundry work and the letter from Mrs. Galton and the 3 households and Virginia Pryce in her parlor constructing an architecture of impossibility. She thought, this is what the arithmetic looks like when all the terms are finally on the page. She went back to find Holt. They left Iron Creek on a Friday morning, heading back up the trail in the May warmth, the passes green and open, the mountains showing their summer faces, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt alongside sections of the trail. She walked the lower sections and rode the mare on the upper ones, and Holt walked all of it, the leg giving him information he processed and continued past, which was the only relationship available between a man and a mended brake that still had opinions. Halfway up, in the afternoon, on a section of trail that opened to a view of the valley below, he stopped. She stopped beside him. They stood and looked at Iron Creek from above. The settlement, small and coherent in its valley, the smoke from the chimneys rising straight in the still May air, the church steeple catching the afternoon light. From this height it looked like what it was. A collection of people trying to make something work in a landscape that required them to be better than they sometimes managed. He said, looking at it, it's smaller from up here, she said. Everything is, he said. Not everything. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, but he said the words in a direction that was not the valley, and she understood what he meant, and felt it in the place that did not have a name, the place where the things that were real and large and permanent lived. They turned and kept climbing. The cabin was as they had left it, which was the particular satisfaction of returning to a place that held itself in your absence. The stove cold but functional, the wood piles stacked, the window intact, the small domestic geography of two people's life, waiting to be inhabited again. She went about the reopening of it with the efficiency of someone who had done it before and knew what order things wanted to go in. Holt started the stove. She set out what they had brought from Cobb's store. The miniature portrait of Anne was where she had left it, in the morning light's path. The books were on the shelf, the herbs in their paper packets. Everything present, he said, from where he was crouching at the stove, feeding the first fire of the new occupation. How do you feel? She considered this. Would you treat them with kindness? She had been considering the version of it that did not have a simple answer. The one that contained the question of where they were and what was coming and what the next months would hold and what they would ask of both of them. She said, steady. He looked at her over his shoulder. She said, I feel steady. That's the word for it. Not certain, not without fear, not without the large unknown portion of all of this. Just steady. She met his eyes across the cabin. I didn't know what steady felt like before. I thought I did. I was managing before, which looks like steady from the outside but isn't the same thing from the inside. She paused. This is the same thing from the inside. He held her eyes for a moment. Would you treat them with kindness? Then he turned back to the stove and finished with the fire, which was his way of receiving something important without making a production of having received it, which she had come to love in him, the way you come to love the specific forms that a specific person uses to be who they are. The fire caught. The cabin warmed. The mountain held still around them in the May evening, the peaks still white against the darkening sky. The meadows below beginning their green argument with the retreating snow, the creek audible if you listened, running clear and fast and entirely itself. Summer came up the mountain the way it always did, slowly, and then all at once, the wild flowers arriving in the high meadows in the order that Holt had described and that she now saw with her own eyes. The Indian paintbrush first in their reds and oranges, then the bluebells, then the wild lupine in purple stands along the creek banks, then the columbine, delicate and precise, in the sheltered places where the snow had stayed longest and had left the ground rich with the memory of water. She planted seeds along the south side of the cabin, not a garden in any formal sense but the beginning of one, the intention of one. Seeds she had brought up from Iron Creek, wrapped in paper in her coat pocket, things that wanted sun and would have it on the south face through the long mountain summer. Holt watched her plant them with the expression that she had learned, contained more than it showed. The surface of it considering, and the interior of it doing something larger and more patient. He said, those will take a season to establish. She said, I know. He said, they might not make it through the first winter. She said, they might not. Would you treat them with kindness? He understood, looking at her crouched over the south-facing ground with her hands in the dark soil, that she was not planting seeds for this summer but for the summer after it, and the one after that she was planting, in the full understanding of the mountain's difficulty, and had decided to plant anyway, which was not optimism in the naive sense but something harder and more accurate. The decision to put things kindness, the decision to put things in the ground, because not putting them in guarantees the outcome you are trying to avoid. He crouched beside her and helped, the large careful hands in the dark, soiled, and they worked together in the May afternoon along the south wall of the cabin until the seeds were in and the ground was patted smooth and the work was done. In late summer, when the passes were fully clear and the season was at its height, and the high country wore the particular reckless beauty of a place that knows its good weather is temporary and intends to be itself fully for as long as it has, the traders and trappers who worked the Iron Creek Range began to tell a story. It was a small story, the kind that travels by word of mouth through the particular network of men who move through remote country and share information at the posts and way stations where they stop. The story was about a cabin at the upper elevation of the range, about a man and a woman who lived there, about sounds that carried down the slopes on still mornings when the wind was in the right direction. The sounds they described were specific, not the general category of human presence, into a place where human presence was unusual. The specific sounds of a life being lived at its full volume, conversation and laughter, and the occasional disagreement that resolved into more laughter. The sounds of a fire being stoked and a meal being made, and two people occupying the same space with the ease of people who have chosen each other past the point where the choice requires daily renegotiation. Would you treat them with kindness? The old people in Iron Creek, the ones who had been watching things long enough to understand what they were watching, heard this story and received it with the quiet satisfaction of a correct prediction. They had watched Holt Greer come down from his mountain for 20 years, twice a year. Would you treat them? The minimum required to resupply his deliberate solitude, and they had watched him go back up each time with the posture of a man returning to an obligation. And then they had watched a girl with broadened shoulders and her dead parents' grit go up after him and come down with him in the spring mud and stand in the main street and say the thing that needed saying. They knew what the sounds from the upper mountain meant. Would you treat them with kindness? They meant that the cabin at 8,000 feet, which had been a place where a man served a sentence he had written for himself, had become a place where two people had decided that the sentence was over, and that what came after it was worth the building. The seeds along the south wall of the cabin did not all survive the first winter. Some did. In the spring of 1824, 3 of the plants she had put in the ground came back. Would you treat them with kindness? Came back not diminished but stronger, the way things come back after a hard winter, with a better root system than they went in with, more prepared for the next one, more certain of their own capacity to hold through the cold. Would you treat them with kindness? She chauffeured Holt the green shoots in the April mud, and he crouched beside them and looked at them with the same complete attention he brought to everything on this mountain. The attention of a man who has learned to read what the land is saying and understands that what it says is worth attending to. He said, "The ones that made it through are the ones that put down deep enough to stay warm." She said, "Yes." He looked at her then, from where he was crouched in the April mud beside the cabin wall, and the look contained everything that did not need saying, everything that had been building since August of the year before, and the well in Iron Creek, and the 4 days of mountain, and the 3 nights of Smarum, and the amber church, and the wind of Fireslight, and the spring, and all the specific, accumulated weight of two people choosing each other repeatedly in conditions that were not easy, and finding that the choosing got easier rather than harder each time they did it. "Nader, one went," he said. "Nora." She said, "I know." He said, "We're going to be all right." She looked at the 3 green shoots in the April mud, and the mountains above them, and the valley below, and the cabin behind them, with its stove and its books and its miniature portrait in the morning light and the life inside it, that they were still in the early stages of understanding how to fully inhabit. She said, "We already are." And that was the truth of it. Plain and structural and not requiring decoration. The truth of two people who had each been told by the world or by themselves that they had used up their portion of the things that mattered, and who had found, in the particular mathematics of one specific mountain winter, that the portion was not used up, that it never had been, that it had been waiting, patient as stone, for someone to come up and claim it.